Most of us learned the same version of the story. Two explorers, a vast untouched wilderness, a young woman pointing the way west, journals filled with wonder, and at the end of it a triumphant arrival at the Pacific Ocean, the continent finally known, finally mapped, finally claimed. It's a clean story, heroic and tidy, the kind that fits neatly into a textbook chapter and gets absorbed and filed away somewhere between the American Revolution and the Civil War. But here's what those textbooks almost never tell you. The America that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark actually walked through, paddled through, froze in, sweated through, and nearly starved in, looked almost nothing like the version we carry in our heads. The rivers were angrier, the land was more inhabited. The diplomacy was more desperate, the insects were, by multiple journal accounts, genuinely unbearable. And the wilderness, that famous untouched wilderness, wasn't untouched at all. What they actually recorded day by day, in meticulous and often exhausted handwriting, is stranger and richer and more human than the legend that replaced it. If you're listening to this right now, and you're already somewhere comfortable, maybe it's late and the lights are low, I want to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. It's one of my favourite things about making these videos. Last time I checked, there were people listening from Edinburgh at 2 in the morning, from Sao Paulo just before sunrise, from small towns in Ohio where it was barely past 9, all of you in completely different versions of night, finding your way to the same story. Tell me where you are, I check. It genuinely matters. And if you want to listen to this ad-free with no music layered underneath, just the story and nothing else, just the history, clean and quiet, exactly the way a lot of you have told me you prefer it. Following there also helps keep this channel going, so if you've been meaning to do it, tonight's a good night. Now, back to 1804, Meriwether Lewis was 30 years old. William Clark was 33. Lewis had been Thomas Jefferson's private secretary, a man chosen specifically because Jefferson trusted his scientific mind and his steadiness under pressure. Clark had military experience, a talent for cartography, and a practical calm that would prove essential when things went wrong, which they did regularly. Together, Jefferson tasked them with leading what was officially called the Corps of Discovery, a small military expedition charged with following the Missouri River to its source, finding a route to the Pacific, and documenting everything along the way: plants, animals, geography, weather, and crucially the native nations they would encounter. Jefferson wanted knowledge. He wanted trade routes. He wanted to understand what the Louisiana Purchase had actually bought. The ink on that agreement was barely dry when the Corps pushed off from Camp du Bois in the spring of 1804, heading into territory that most Americans of European descent had never seen and could only partially imagine. What they found was not what Jefferson imagined, and it's not what most of us imagine either. This isn't going to be the version where two men cut bravely through emptiness. The journals they kept, Lewis's careful naturalist observations, Clark's detailed navigational notes, the entries written by sergeants and privates in the Corps, are too specific, too honest, too full of complaint and confusion and genuine awe for that kind of myth to survive a close reading. These were real people, often cold, often sick, occasionally terrified, frequently wrong about what lay ahead, and dependent in ways that often go unacknowledged on the knowledge, the generosity, and the diplomacy of the people already living in that landscape. The approach here is evidence-led. When the journals say something clearly, we'll follow that. When historians and archaeologists interpret that evidence in different ways, we'll say so. There are things we genuinely don't know about what the Corps experienced, and this is a story comfortable sitting with uncertainty. History isn't always a clean line from question to answer. Sometimes it's a river full of snags, which, as it happens, is a very accurate description of the Missouri in 1804. but here is the central thing worth holding on to as we begin. The expedition you probably think you know was shaped decades later by people who wanted it to mean something specific. The Manifest Destiny version, the empty continent version, the lone civilization pushing into darkness version, the actual expedition, the one recorded in real time by people who were living it and weren't sure how it would end, is considerably more complicated. It includes nations who had been managing those landscapes for centuries. It includes weather that nearly killed them in ways the myth glosses over. It includes moments of remarkable cross-cultural exchange and moments of genuine diplomatic failure. It includes an America that was already deeply, intricately human before the Corps arrived to write it down. The journals survived. That's the remarkable thing. All of that fear and wonder and tedium and sickness and astonishment, it was written down by people who understood they were seeing something that wouldn't last, even if they couldn't fully predict what would come next. So we have their words, we have their observations, and we have a century of scholarship working to understand what those words actually describe. What we're going to do is follow that evidence west, starting at the Missouri, moving through the Great Plains into the Rockies, down the western slope, all the way to the Pacific. Not as legend, as something closer to what it actually was. Get comfortable. We're heading into 1804. Thomas Jefferson had a very specific idea of what the American West was. He had spent years thinking about it, collecting maps, interviewing fur traders, reading every account he could find of the territories that lay beyond the Mississippi. He was one of the most intellectually curious men of his era, and the Louisiana Purchase, that enormous swath of land acquired from France in 1803 for roughly $15 million, had handed him something he could barely contain his excitement about. A continent to know, a mystery to solve. And he had just the men to solve it. What Jefferson imagined lay out there was shaped, more than he probably realized, by incomplete information layered over optimistic theory. He believed, based on the geographic reasoning of his time, that the Rocky Mountains were probably something like the Appalachians. A single ridge, or maybe a modest chain, that could be crossed in a matter of days. On the other side, he expected rivers draining conveniently toward the Pacific, creating what he called the Northwest Passage by land, a direct navigable route from the Missouri to the Columbia to the sea. Clean, logical, tradable, the kind of geography that empire could work with. He also believed the interior was sparsely populated by scattered native peoples who would be receptive to American diplomatic overtures, interested in trade goods, and open to acknowledging, at least symbolically, the authority of the new nation now claiming the territory around them. Jefferson wasn't ignorant of Native America, exactly, but his picture of it was filtered through a particular kind of wishful thinking. He imagined manageable diplomacy, polite councils, nations who would recognize a reasonable offer when they heard one. The gap between that imagined West and the actual West begins almost immediately after the Corps pushed off from Camp Dubois in May of 1804. It doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, gradually, as the Missouri makes its true character known, as the maps prove unreliable, as the scale of what lies ahead starts to become apparent. But we'll get to the river in the next section. For now it's worth sitting with what the Corps actually was, and what they were actually working with, because it shapes everything that follows. The Corps of Discovery was a military unit first and a scientific expedition second, though both functions were always operating simultaneously. Lewis and Clark were commissioned officers. The men under them were soldiers who had enlisted specifically for this mission, or been selected from existing posts. They had ranks, duties, schedules, chain of command. Every morning there was work, wood to cut, boats to manage, game to hunt, gear to dry or repair or redistribute. The journals that survive from this expedition weren't written in comfortable camp chairs at the end of leisurely days. They were written by exhausted men who had been hauling boats upstream in brutal current since dawn, who might be back at it before full light the next morning, who were managing their health and their provisions and their relationships with nations they had never encountered and couldn't fully communicate with. That context matters when you read an entry that seems sparse or rushed or incomplete. It doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the man writing it was tired. Lewis and Clark both kept journals, but so did several of the sergeants, including John Ordway, Patrick Gass, and Charles Floyd, who died early in the journey, and whose brief entries offer their own perspective on events. The journals weren't always written on the same day things occurred. Lewis in particular went through stretches where he wrote little or nothing, then returned and reconstructed events from memory and notes. Clark was more consistent, but his spelling was famously creative, and his geographic estimates, while often impressive, could drift in ways that only became apparent when checked against later surveys. The point isn't that the journals are unreliable. They're remarkably valuable. The point is that they're human documents, produced under pressure by people with different strengths and blind spots, and reading them carefully means reading them with all of that in mind. The maps Jefferson provided were genuinely the best available at the time, which tells you something about the state of available knowledge. They were based on accounts from fur traders, indigenous descriptions translated and filtered through multiple languages and misunderstandings, earlier Spanish and British surveys that were incomplete or deliberately obscured for geopolitical reasons, and a great deal of informed guesswork. Some sections of the Missouri were reasonably well known to Euro-American traders operating out of St. Louis. Others were essentially blank. The upper reaches of the river, the location of the Continental Divide, the nature and extent of the Rocky Mountains, the course of the rivers on the western slope, these were questions without reliable answers. Jefferson knew this. He instructed Lewis and Clark to pay careful attention to geography, precisely because he understood how little was actually mapped. But knowing the information is incomplete and having better information are different things. They were working with what existed. Here is what often gets skipped over in the standard telling, though it shouldn't. The information that actually guided the Corps through the most difficult terrain didn't come from Jefferson's maps. It came from the people already living there. The native nations of the Missouri Valley, the Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountains had been navigating, trading across, and managing these landscapes for centuries. They had mental maps of extraordinary precision. They knew where rivers forked, where mountain passes were accessible by season, where bison concentrated in late summer, where dangerous rapids waited around particular bends. And they shared much of this knowledge with the Corps, sometimes out of genuine goodwill, sometimes as part of deliberate diplomatic calculation, sometimes through the interpreters who worked at the fragile edges of multiple languages trying to make meaning hold together. This is where the word discovery starts to require some honest examination. The framing that Jefferson used that Lewis and Clark carried west with them was one of revelation, Americans discovering a new world. But from the perspective of the Mandan and Hidatsa villages on the upper Missouri, the Shoshone in the mountains, the Nez Perce on the western slope, the Chinook near the Pacific coast, this was not new land being found for the first time. These were homelands. They were trade corridors that had been in operation for generations, with established protocols, known routes, and complex political relationships between nations. The Corps wasn't moving through emptiness. They were moving through a densely networked human world that had its own history and its own understanding of what their arrival might mean. Some nations were welcoming, some were cautious. Some had reasons, which the journals occasionally capture, and which we'll explore as the journey unfolds, to be neither. The diplomatic encounters the Corps undertook were not simply Americans introducing themselves to people who had no context for what was happening. They were Americans inserting themselves into existing geopolitical relationships between nations with their own interests, their own memories of prior contact with European powers, and their own assessments of what these newcomers were actually offering and asking. Jefferson's instructions to Lewis and Clark included explicit guidance on how to conduct these councils. bring gifts, which they did, including peace medals stamped with Jefferson's image, deliver speeches explaining the transfer of the territory to American authority, as though French or Spanish paper claims had changed the fundamental reality on the ground, which, from the perspective of nations who had been there long before any European nation existed, they hadn't. Gather as much geographic and political intelligence as possible. Assess trade potential. Note anything that might matter strategically. It was, in other words, a reconnaissance of empire dressed in the language of science and friendship. Lewis and Clark themselves seem to have understood this, though they probably wouldn't have used those words. They were careful, often genuinely respectful men operating within the assumptions of their time. They also made mistakes, misread situations, underestimated the sophistication of what they were encountering. The journals show both things: genuine curiosity about the people they met, and the occasional bafflement of someone who expected the world to arrange itself along lines that were familiar. What the Corps actually faced then, as they prepared to move up the Missouri, was this: a mission with clear political urgency and enormous geographic uncertainty, equipment and provisions that were adequate but not generous, men of varying temperament who had been formed into something that would need to hold together under conditions no one could fully anticipate, maps that told partial truths, official expectations built on incomplete information, and ahead of them a continent that was not waiting to be discovered, but was already known, already inhabited, already moving according to its own rhythms and relationships, into which they were about to introduce themselves, for better and worse, with everything they carried and everything they lacked. Jefferson imagined knowledge arriving cleanly, like a report filed and filed away. What the Corps actually produced was messier and more human than that, which is precisely why it's still worth following, because the mess is where the real history lives. For Lewis and Clark, the West did not begin with mountains or bison or sweeping vistas. It began with water, with the Missouri River, which, on most modern maps, looks like a simple blue line arcing northwest. It's easy to imagine them gliding along that line, the boats moving steadily, men at their posts, the river helpfully carrying them toward the interior. But that blue line is lying to you. In 1804, the Missouri was not a calm water highway. It was a living, shifting machine designed to break boats, exhaust men, and grind progress down to something that felt almost symbolic. A few hard-won miles in a day, sometimes less. Then the same thing tomorrow. And the next day, and the next. The core misunderstanding is direction. Rivers are easy when you're going with them. The Corps was not. They were pushing upstream, against a notoriously fast, turbid current. The Missouri at that time was a classic Great Plains river, full of silt, always eroding one bank, building the other, cutting new channels, abandoning old ones. The water you step into one year is not quite the same river the next. Going against that meant muscle, not romance. They had three main kinds of boats when they left: the big keel boat, often called the barge in the journals, and two smaller pirogues. None of these were motorized, obviously. They moved through a combination of rowing, poling, sailing when the wind permitted, and, most brutally, towing. Men harnessed themselves to ropes on shore and walked, hauling tons of wood and cargo against the river's force, like human draft animals. The journals are dry about this because the work was so constant it barely seemed worth remarking on. Proceeded on, Clark writes again and again, two words that conceal everything. The hours of leaning into poles set against the river bottom, feet slipping in mud, shoulders burning. The shouted commands to keep a boat from slewing sideways. The cold shock when someone lost their footing and the current took them under the keel and out behind before they could gasp. Rowing sounds cleaner, but against that flow it was punishing. Oars bit into heavy, sediment-thick water. The boat inched forward. A gust of wind, a moment of inattention, and you lost 10 feet you just worked for. They were fighting a conveyor belt, and that was on a good stretch. Beneath the surface, the Missouri hid what they called snags, entire trees, ripped from upstream banks, swept down and lodged invisibly in the riverbed, their branches or trunks waiting just below the waterline. Hit one wrong and your boat could be ripped open. The river's colour made this worse. It was famously muddy, like thick coffee. Some later observers said, "You didn't see the danger until you felt the jolt." The men watched the surface constantly for odd ripples, odd patterns in the current that hinted at something below. Sometimes they guessed right, and the boat slid past with inches to spare. Sometimes they didn't. There are entries about stopping to repair damaged rudders, reinforce hulls, patch seams. Obliged to halt to mend the boat. A single sentence standing in for several frantic hours of labour on a riverbank, trying to keep the expedition's main vessel from becoming an expensive leaking box. Then there were the sandbars. The Missouri built them and erased them almost at will. A stretch that had been deep enough last season might now be a shallow fan of sand. The boat would ease forward, the depth dropping, and then, with a grinding hesitation, it stopped, stuck. Sometimes they could use poles to pry themselves free. Sometimes that failed, and it was back to unloading, barrels, crates, equipment carried piece by piece to shore, the lighter hull manhandled into deeper water, then everything carried back again. When we imagine exploration, we picture forward motion. The Corps spent a surprising amount of time simply getting unstuck. Overlay all of this with weather. Summer on the Missouri could turn ugly very quickly. Thunderstorms rolled off the plains with little warning. A strong headwind could halt progress entirely, or blow up the river's surface into short, vicious waves that slapped at the boats and made steering difficult. Lightning cracked over open water, rain-soaked cargo and men alike. They lashed down what they could, then rode it out, hoping nothing snapped or tore or went overboard. Capsizing was an ever-present possibility, especially when boats were heavily loaded and the channel narrowed or twisted aggressively around a bend. One misjudged angle against the current, one fast eddy catching the hull broadside, and the whole structure could roll. We know from the journals they had a few close calls. In some places they unloaded part of the cargo in advance, just to lessen the risk. Imagine how that changes your sense of distance, not just how far you must travel, but how many times you might have to carry everything you own across unstable ground to keep it from going under. All of this work also did something subtler. It changed time. On land, walking 10, 15, even 20 miles in a day is demanding but conceptually straightforward. You see the landscape change, feel the ground under your feet alter. On the river, going upstream, a 10-mile day was respectable. Some days they did less. The river braided, split into multiple channels, forced them into detours. They camped in sight of a bluff they had been looking at since morning, and might still see again from a slightly different angle tomorrow. The effect is strange. You move constantly, but the world seems to turn slowly. The same muddy banks, the same cottonwood groves, the same long grasses rippling back from the shore. The same routines. Wake, eat, haul, curse, adjust, repair, set camp, write a few lines if your hand isn't shaking from fatigue, sleep, repeat. Mental fatigue settles in, not just from exertion, but from repetition. Time stretches, then blurs. Navigation under those conditions was less like following a map and more like continual improvisation, especially once they moved beyond the sections known to St. Louis traders. The charts stopped being instructions and became, at best, suggestions. The river itself was the only reliable guide, and it was not interested in being predictable. Each morning, Lewis and Clark made choices. Which channel seems deeper? Which bank looks less eroded? Whether to attempt a tricky bend today or wait and rest men and equipment. Sometimes they sent out small parties to scout ahead when the river split, trying to determine which branch was the main stem and which was a dead-end shoaling toward nothing. They were not confidently marching into the unknown. They were negotiating with it hour by hour, bend by bend. And yet, because rivers concentrate life, the shorelines were often ecologically rich in ways the interior prairie was not. The men saw flocks of waterfowl, beaver slides, fresh sign of deer, elk, sometimes bison coming to drink. Cottonwoods and willows lined many stretches, offering at least some shade and a source of wood for repairs. Berry thickets. Fish in the eddies later, farther upstream. They would begin to record new species, animals and plants Eastern science had never catalogued. But the same density that made the river's edge abundant also made it difficult. Thick vegetation could snag tow ropes or hide holes and washouts in the bank that turned a step into a fall. Mosquitoes and other insects thrived. The air near the water was heavy in summer, humid, carrying the smells of mud, decay, and animal life. Bodies already tired from hauling boats now had to contend with bites, rashes, fevers that may have been mosquito-borne. The journals mentioned them briefly, the men lived them constantly. This tension between richness and friction shaped what the Corps noticed and what they didn't. When you're fighting the current, your attention narrows. You see the snag directly ahead, not the subtle pattern of how snags accumulate on one side of a bend more than another. You hear the thunder of an approaching storm, not the finer gradations of birdsong shifting with season. You record what matters for survival first. Water depth, bank stability, landing sites, fuel, game. Some entries burst with detailed observations of plants, animals, and geological formations. Others, on days when the river had demanded everything, a little more than a line or two about distance and weather. It's not that there was less to see, it's that the observer was worn down. So when we picture the Corps moving up the Missouri, it's worth replacing the effortless glide with something grittier and more accurate. Think of a handful of boats wrestling their way against a powerful, changeable river. Men straining on tow ropes, cursing sandbars, hauling poles, making constant small decisions that determined whether the expedition advanced or stalled or suffered a setback that might echo for weeks. The Missouri was not just background. It was the first great antagonist of the journey, the road they had no choice but to take. And understanding how hard that road was is crucial, because everything else they encountered, villages, wildlife, weather, diplomacy, unfolded for them through bodies already carrying the weight of that upstream fight. By the time we usually drop Lewis and Clark into our mental movie, the scene is clean. Big sky, endless grass, a kind of sacred emptiness stretching away from the riverbanks, as if the Corps has slipped off the edge of the world and into untouched creation. That picture is comforting. It's also mostly wrong. The land along the Missouri in 1804 wasn't blank. It was lived in, argued over, burned, planted, harvested, and managed for generations before a single American flag showed up on a pole. When the Corps looked at those banks, they were seeing the surface of an ongoing human story that did not start with them and did not consider itself wilderness. The first clue is simply time. By 1804, many of the communities along the lower and middle Missouri had already been settled, in some form, for centuries. Horticultural villages, people growing corn, beans, squash, and more, had risen, fallen, moved, rebuilt. Earth Lodge towns came and went on slightly different spots along the same bends, following patterns of soil exhaustion, flooding, trade, and war. To the expedition, this could look new, fresh, as if they were the first to write this landscape down. They weren't. When they passed what looked like open prairie, they were often moving through land cleared, maintained, and intentionally kept open by native fire. Controlled burning broadcast fires set at particular seasons and frequencies did several things at once. It reduced brush and tree seedlings, encouraged new grass, attracted bison and other grazers, controlled certain pests and made travel easier. To a Euro-American eye trained on European forests and hedgerows, a wide park-like grassland with scattered groves might read as natural scenery. To the people who lived there, it was closer to a garden, a mosaic of habitats created over time by deliberate choices about when and where to light the match. This management wasn't written in fences or straight lines. It was written in age classes of trees, in where berry shrubs clustered, in how the undergrowth thinned near certain trails. Signs you notice only if you've been taught to read them. Agriculture added another layer. Lewis and Clark did recognize some of this. They describe cornfields, beans, pumpkins, sunflowers, tobacco. At large villages like those of the Omaha, the Arikara, later the Mandan and Hidatsa, the scale impressed them. Miles of fields surrounding earth-lodged towns, drying racks, granaries, people who clearly had surplus, storage and systems for redistributing food. But agriculture didn't only mean dense, obvious fields packed around permanent towns. Smaller plots, satellite gardens and shifting cultivation existed alongside the big centres. A cleared patch on a bottomland, a line of young trees marking an old field boundary, an abandoned village site slowly being reclaimed by grass. These could all slip past tired eyes focused on the next bend in the river. If you expect real farming to look like straight European furrows or brick-walled farms, you can drift past a centuries-old managed environment and call it wild. Travel itself carved human patterns into the landscape. The Missouri was a main road, but it wasn't the only one. Trails radiated from the river like spokes from a hub, following ridges, creek valleys, and low passes. Some were seasonal hunting routes, some were diplomatic corridors, used year after year for councils and trade. Some connected one cluster of villages to another, forming regional networks of movement and exchange. The Corps used a few of these trails directly, portages, hunting forays, visits to nearby towns. They also repeatedly relied on indigenous knowledge of where those paths went. People told them how far to the next nation, where to find a ford, what creek led toward which divide. Every time the journals say something like informed that a road passes hence to, they're touching the edge of a map that already existed in other minds. A map made not of empty distance, but of remembered camps, reliable springs, sacred places, danger zones. Even the river crossings they depended on weren't accidents of nature. Some fords had long histories of use, with approaches cleared, banks cut in gentle slopes, maybe even brush and debris kept down so horses and loaded people could get through. To someone used to engineered bridges, a bare crossing might look unimproved. To local people, it could be as intentional as a paved road. Then there were the trade routes. Long before the Corps, goods moved through this region. Shells from distant coasts, metal from French traders, horses from the south and west, cloth and beads and guns, making their way from one nation to the next. Lewis and Clark walked into an economy already in motion, with its own credit systems, obligations, and expectations. They record receiving gifts and giving others, corn, dogs for meat, robes, horses, pipes, ornaments. Those exchanges rested on layers of prior connections. Who had traded with whom? Who had hosted whose relatives? Who had recently been at peace or at war? In that sense, the Corps wasn't cutting through wilderness. They were entering a living political geography where rivers and prairies had diplomatic borders as real, if less visible than any line on Jefferson's maps. One of the reasons later readers picture emptiness is that Lewis and Clark did at times write about deserted villages or no inhabitants along a stretch of shore. It's easy to take those phrases literally, to imagine unclaimed ground, but empty to them often meant something else. Many indigenous communities in this region practiced seasonal movement. Villages might be heavily occupied in certain months, then largely abandoned while people spread out to hunt, gather, or visit allies and kin elsewhere. Earth lodges stood, caches remained buried, fields waited for the right moment. From a passing boat in the wrong season, you see nobody and think, no permanent settlement. An abandoned village might not be a ruin from long ago. It could be a place abandoned last year because of disease, flood, or conflict, or a site temporarily relocated upriver for better trade access, leaving behind storage pits and partially collapsed lodges. To those who knew the backstory, each post, each depression in the ground, had names attached, families who once lived there, events that had unfolded. To an expedition just proceeding on, it could blur into scenery. Conflict reshaped the map as well. The early 1800s were not a peaceful, static moment. Epidemics from earlier waves of European contact had rolled through. Horses had transformed warfare and mobility. Some nations were in the middle of pushing others out of key hunting grounds. Others were reforming in new locations, consolidating survivors. So when the Corps travelled through what seemed like uninhabited stretches, they might be moving through contested buffer zones, areas avoided because raids were common, or because treaties between neighbouring groups designated them as neutral ground. Silence in the journals does not mean silence on the ground. It can mean, we were advised not to linger here. Add diplomacy, and the pattern grows more complex. Indigenous politics shaped who chose to be present when the Americans came. Word of the expedition travelled ahead of them. Some communities decided to meet them in force, show numbers, emphasize strength. Others sent only a few representatives downriver, keeping most of their people elsewhere until they understood the newcomers' intentions. Still others, wary or hostile, avoided direct contact altogether. As a result, the core experience of who lives here was filtered through these choices. If a nation decided not to camp along the main channel while the Americans passed, the landscape could look far more empty than it really was. Villages tucked a few miles inland might go unrecorded. Trails that bent away from the river might as well not exist. Layer on top of all this the lens they brought with them. The men of the Corps had categories for land, farm, village, forest, waste. They looked for ploughed fields, fences, stone buildings, permanent roads. When they didn't see those, they had a tendency, in their writings at least, to slide toward words like unimproved, wild, vacant. Those words did political work back in Washington. They made it easier to imagine treaties, purchases, and, eventually, dispossession. But under those labels were orchards of wild planted fruit trees, selectively harvested stands of timber, burning regimes that kept grasslands lush, fishing sites engineered with weirs and stakes, berry patches that people visited year after year. 1,000 small human interventions designed not to fix the land into rigid boundaries, but to keep it flexible, resilient, and productive. So when we follow the expedition up the Missouri in our minds, it helps to change the frame. Don't see the banks as untouched. See them as a palimpsest, layers of previous use, some visible, some faint, some wiped clean by flood or fire and started again. The Corps was not charting empty space. They were moving through someone else's mental atlas, often without knowing it. Each bend, each prairie, each wooded island could carry meanings, ownership, memory, taboo, that no American map of 1804 recorded. Their journey, from the very beginning, intersected living political geographies. Every camp they chose was also a place someone else might claim for planting or hunting. Every stretch they labelled barren might be a hunting ground in waiting, set aside by fire and season. Every treaty council they imagined as the first was, in reality, one more meeting layered onto a long tradition of councils under cottonwoods and on high bluffs overlooking this same difficult river. Once you see that, the idea of Lewis and Clark as lone pathfinders in virgin nature starts to dissolve. They were travellers on routes that others had already traced, reading a landscape that had been carefully, quietly human for a very long time. If the land wasn't empty of people, it wasn't empty of animals either. Lewis and Clark's journals are full of what later readers love to quote: immense herds, incredible numbers, infinite multitudes of bison, elk, antelope, waterfowl. It's tempting to imagine that once they pushed beyond the farm fields of the lower Missouri, meat simply walked up and volunteered for dinner. It didn't. Those scenes of abundance were real, but they were moments, snapshots, set inside a daily grind that felt much less secure. From the expedition's point of view, every sunrise came with the same quiet question: do we have enough meat to feed more than 30 men today and tomorrow and the day after that? Numbers make the problem clearer. A single adult doing that kind of labour, hauling boats, cutting wood, marching, standing guard, could easily burn 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day. Now multiply that by the size of the corps, add in interpreters, occasional visitors, and the needs of dogs and horses when they had them. Even allowing for flour, corn, and other rations, they were running a deficit that only meat could close. So when the journals say men employed in hunting, that isn't background colour. That is survival work. Hunting took time. It meant leaving the safety and known route of the river, walking miles into country you didn't fully understand, often in heat, cold, or driving wind. It meant carrying a heavy firearm, powder, lead, maybe an extra shirt or some small provisions. It meant getting separated from the main party when there was no easy way to call or coordinate. And then there was the uncertainty. You could go out in the morning expecting to see game plentiful and come back at dusk empty-handed, having burned energy you couldn't easily spare. You could also stumble onto more animals than you had men, ammunition, or daylight to process. The famous days when they felled dozens of animals were double-edged. A feast, yes, but also hours of butchering, hauling, preserving, and guarding meat from scavengers and thieves, human and non-human. The weapons themselves imposed limits. Most of the corps still relied on smooth-bore muskets and simple rifles. Every shot cost powder and lead, both finite and heavy to carry. You couldn't afford to waste ammunition trying for distant or bad-angle shots. Misfires were common. A damp charge, a faulty flint, a poorly cast ball could mean the difference between fresh dinner and another dip into dwindling stores of dried meat and corn. Every kill came with physical risk. Close-range hunting of large animals meant getting near hooves, horns, and sheer momentum. An elk can break a leg. A charging bison can crush ribs. Even a deer, if wounded and desperate, can kick hard enough to do serious damage. Slippery riverbanks, prairie dog holes hidden in the grass, and sudden gullies added ambient danger. A twisted ankle could take a hunter out of rotation. A broken bone could threaten his life. That risk was magnified by the rhythm of animal behaviour and the seasons. Game didn't distribute itself evenly like pieces on a board. Bison moved in herds that shifted with grass and water. Elk and deer favoured certain cover, certain times of day. Waterfowl might darken the sky during migration, and then, weeks later, become scarce ghosts on distant sloughs. Insects, heat, and the quality of forage shifted where and when animals wanted to be. Lewis and Clark noticed some of this. They remark on animals growing lean in late winter, on bison leaving areas where grass had been heavily grazed or burned, on the way pronghorn antelope preferred the open prairie and stayed just far enough out of range. But they were always playing catch-up to local knowledge. Native hunters already understood the schedules. When bison usually came through a given stretch, what wind patterns would spook deer from a bottomland? How a shift in bird calls might mean predators nearby. The corps was learning in real time, with far less margin for error. Their own presence reshaped the game around them. 30-plus men, dragging boats upriver, chopping wood, singing, shouting orders, firing guns for practice and defence. That's a lot of noise and scent. Camp after camp left behind ashes, scraps, latrine pits, and the heavy human smell that many animals interpret as danger. Even in a region rich in wildlife, the immediate ring around their night spots could quickly become quiet. Over days and weeks, that meant hunting parties had to travel farther from camp to find animals that hadn't already been startled or pressured away. It also meant that the bison herds Lewis counted so eagerly at one bend might thin noticeably after repeated forays, especially if local indigenous hunters were also taking care not to let animals become too wary of particular approaches or ambush sites. Overhunting in a modern industrial sense was not yet the issue it would become later in the 19th century, but local overuse was possible. The combination of native subsistence and trade hunting, plus the sudden arrival of an unusually large meat-hungry foreign party, could create temporary scarcity in specific zones. The journal's occasional complaints about no game in sight often reflect that localized depletion. And then there were the animals that shaped the expedition's sense of danger. Popular retellings love to highlight grizzly bears, and for good reason. The Corps' encounters with them are some of the most vivid pages in the journals. Multiple shots failing to bring a bear down quickly, wounded animals still charging, men retreating to the river in panic. Those stories aren't mere bravado. They reflect a recalibration of risk. Bears east of the Mississippi were one thing. These massive, tundra-fed, rarely hunted predators were another. But fear wasn't only about claws and teeth. Wolves, often mentioned in chorus with howling at night or trailing along the edges of camps, were less a direct threat to human life than to human food. A wolf pack could strip an unwatched carcass quickly. Coyotes, foxes, and raptors did their part too. When your meat is your survival, losing part of a kill to scavengers stings. It also forces you to post guards, sleep less, or rush butchering jobs that really require time and care. Snakes, especially rattlesnakes on rocky bluffs and in prairie dog towns, added another layer of tension. A bite far from camp, with limited medical understanding and no antivenom, could be catastrophic. The journals record cautious killing of snakes near camps and along trails, not because every snake was a mortal enemy, but because the cost of a mistake was unacceptably high. Even harmless animals could loom large in the expedition's risk calculations. Bison herds, if startled in the wrong direction, were capable of stampeding across a campsite or overturning boats near a crossing. A herd moving at night might sound like thunder and remain invisible until the last moment. Horses borrowed or acquired from native nations could spook at sudden movement, bolt, or injure handlers. In the context of a long expedition, an injured horse could mean lost transport for goods they couldn't afford to leave behind. Behind all these experiences was the filter of 1804 knowledge and language. When Lewis described a new or unfamiliar species, he did so using the categories and comparisons available to him. An animal might be called a goat or sheep based on horns and behavior, even if it wasn't closely related in the biological sense we'd use today. Antelope became the chosen label for pronghorns, though modern taxonomy puts them in their own unique family. A burrowing rodent with social behavior and distinctive calls became the famed barking squirrel, later standardized in English as the prairie dog. What the Corps chose to notice and record was shaped by what seemed useful, curious, or theoretically important to them. They measured antlers, counted the number of young in a litter, noted fat content and taste. They speculated on migration, breeding, and diet. Their words carry the assumptions of early 19th century natural history, a mix of keen observation, limited comparative data, and a tendency to fit new creatures into old-world frames. That means when we read Countless Buffalo, we need to remember that countless is a feeling, not a census. When we see this animal appears to be of the deer kind, we have to mentally translate from their categories to ours. The same goes for their moral judgments: timid, fierce, stupid, vigilant. Those are impressions from hungry, tired men with guns in their hands, not neutral scientific labels. Yet through that filter a consistent picture emerges. The Missouri Valley in 1804 was rich in animal life, but not endlessly generous. It required knowledge, local, indigenous, seasonal knowledge, to tap that richness predictably. The Corps, entering as outsiders, experienced both the highs of astonishing abundance and the lows of anxious scarcity. They learned day by day that meat did not simply exist out there waiting to be tallied. It had to be found, stalked, killed, processed, defended, and carried. Their journey wasn't a sightseeing tour through a wildlife museum. It was a constant negotiation with other living beings, in a landscape where those beings had their own patterns, their own histories with human hunters, and their own ways of responding to this noisy, persistent, meat-hungry band pushing slowly upstream. And while they learned to read those patterns, their bodies paid the price in sore feet, near misses, sleepless nights listening for bears and wolves beyond the firelight, and the ever-present calculation: how far can we go tomorrow on what we managed to kill today? If animals were one part of the negotiation, the weather was another, and it was constant. You couldn't hunt, haul, or even think very clearly without first passing through whatever the sky decided to do to you that day. For the men of the Corps of Discovery, the Missouri River wasn't just a line on a map. It was a long, moving corridor of humidity, wind, and glare that wrapped itself around their bodies every waking hour. Start with the sun. On a cloudless summer day, the prairie offered almost nothing in the way of shade. Trees clustered in bottomlands and along some banks, but for long stretches there was simply open grass and sky. The men rowed, poled, or towed the boats upstream with the light bouncing off the water into their eyes and off the sandbars into their faces. Hats helped, but not completely. The journals mention intense heat and oppressive warmth, but the words flatten the feeling. Shirts glued to the skin with sweat, salt crusting at the edges of collars, lips drying and splitting, vision pulsing at the edge of a headache. Clothing was not modern, quick-dry fabric, wool, linen, leather. Once wet by sweat, rain, or the daily work of wading in and out of the river, it stayed wet for a long time. A man might begin a day soaked from a sudden thunderstorm, labour through the humid afternoon in clammy cloth that rubbed at his armpits and thighs, then lie down at night still damp under blankets that had absorbed the same moisture. In summer that meant rashes, sores, and the constant low-level irritation of chafed skin. In cooler seasons it became more serious. Damp cloth sucks heat away from the body. A man who had sweated hard at the towel-line in the afternoon could sit down to supper just as the wind shifted, the temperature dropped, and the day's moisture turned from inconvenience to hazard. The journals mention cold and disagreeable rain, but again the phrase hides the texture. Fingers numb and clumsy on gun flints, boots that never quite dried, the ache in the small of your back that never entirely went away. Then there was full-on cold. By the time they wintered at places like Camp Dubois and Fort Mandan, and later on the western side of the Rockies, they were dealing with real frost and deep snow. At Fort Mandan, temperatures dropped far below freezing, sometimes to levels that made ink thick and breath hurt. Men on guard duty rotated not just for security, but because no one could stand still in that kind of cold for very long. Frostbite was not a theoretical risk. Exposed ears, fingers, and toes in stiff boots were vulnerable. The solution, most of the time, was simply to endure, pile on buffalo robes, huddle by the fire when possible, and keep working when it wasn't. But long exposure also meant joints stiffening, old injuries flaring, minor cuts and blisters, turning into something more dangerous because circulation was compromised. Between summer heat and winter cold lay the shoulder seasons, when the ground could be half frozen in the morning and muddy by noon. Those were the days when constant damp was literal. Dew-soaked bedrolls before sunrise. River fog clung to everything. The boats themselves, leaky by modern standards, added another layer of moisture. Any time they hauled cargo, their hands met wet rope, wet wood, wet barrels. The damp worked its way into seams of clothing and under fingernails, softening skin until it split. Skin softened like that doesn't take much to fail. A boot rubs a little too hard on the heel. A rope burns across the palm. On a modern hike, you might take a day off, clean and bandage the area, let it air out. On the Missouri, you kept going. You laced the same boot. You gripped the same rope. You rolled that damaged skin against coarse fibres again and again, and every time you did, you opened another door for infection. And surrounding all of this, almost like a second weather system, were the insects. Modern readers often imagine the mosquitoes in Alaska or the North Woods and think they understand. The journals suggest that what Lewis and Clark met along some stretches of the Missouri and its tributaries rivaled anything we'd call extreme today. They write of incredible swarms of men unable to sleep, of smoke made not for warmth or cooking, but simply to have a place to breathe without inhaling bugs. Mosquitoes and gnats weren't just irritating. They were biting through thin cloth, into skin already irritated by sweat and friction. Every bite was another itch, another temptation to scratch with dirty fingernails. That meant more open skin, more opportunity for bacteria. The buzzing itself became a kind of noise that never shut off, a thin, high whine that drilled into the spaces where quiet might otherwise have let the mind rest. Sleep, already limited by guard duty and early starts, took another hit. Men slapped at their own skin in the dark. They buried their faces in blankets that were themselves infested. They woke with eyes puffy and hands swollen, then climbed back into the boats for another day of labour. Morale eroded not in spectacular outbursts, but in long, hot, itchy stretches where tempers shortened and patience thinned. Insects also carried diseases. Malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses were part of the early American landscape, especially in low, wet areas. The upper Missouri was less malarial than some river valleys farther south and east, but fevers, chills, and ague were still familiar experiences. When you read of men taken ill, complaining of weakness, headaches, or strange sweats, it's easy to imagine more than one of those episodes as insect-related. Beyond the insects came the whole catalogue of small grinding ailments that appear in the journals: diarrhea, dysentery, respiratory infections, toothaches, sprains, unexplained fevers. In an age before germ theory, the medical kit leaned heavily on bleeding, purging, and strong laxatives. Lewis had some training, and he carried what, for the time, was a well-equipped set of medicines, opium preparations, emetics, calomel, various botanicals. Some of these helped, others, like mercury-based compounds, probably did their own kind of slow harm. Water quality fluctuated. The men drank from the same river they bathed and washed clothing in. Upstream animal carcasses, human waste, and general runoff all fed into their cups. Boiling water took time and fuel. It was not practiced consistently. Digestive issues, looseness, violent purging appear again and again in the record. Each bout meant dehydration, weakness, and lost calories at a moment when every bit of energy was already spoken for. Injuries, too, were woven into daily life. A slip on a muddy bank could mean a gashed shin from a hidden rock, a broken rib from a bad fall, a wrenched knee that never quite went back to normal. Gun accidents, though less frequent than might be expected, did happen. There were burns from cooking fires, eyes irritated by smoke, hands crushed under shifting cargo. Every injury had to be managed inside the same weather that caused it. Bandages wet from rain, splints swollen and warped by humidity, wounds exposed to flies and dust. Underneath all of this physical strain ran the mental currents. Days were often monotonous. The same bend of river, the same work at the poles, the same ration of meat or corn, the same roll of bedding at night. The novelty of discovery, new plants, new animals, new human communities, came in bursts, but much of the expedition was repetition. Monotony by itself is not lethal, but combined with fatigue and discomfort, it wears at morale. Homesickness was real. Many of the enlisted men were young, far from familiar towns and families, headed into a region that in Euro-American terms had no clear map back. Letters were impossible. News from home did not exist. When someone fell ill, he did so with no easy way to imagine how his family would even learn his fate if he died. Anxiety came in layers. There was the immediate worry about weather, food, and health. There was apprehension about encounters with unfamiliar native nations. Would this next village welcome them, ignore them, or see them as a threat? And over all this lay the weight on Lewis and Clark themselves. The knowledge that Jefferson's expectations rode on their success, that misjudging a route, a season, or a political situation could doom not just them, but the entire vision of a continental republic stretching to the Pacific. Leadership under those conditions meant more than bold decisions at dramatic moments. It meant steady responses to slow suffering, deciding when to stop and lay by for weather, when to push on even though everyone was exhausted, when to distribute a little extra liquor or tobacco to lift spirits, when to downplay a setback in the journals so that the official record would show resolve rather than despair. This is part of why later heroic narratives smooth out the misery. It is easy to tell a story that jumps from a thunderstorm to a grisly attack to a triumphant council with a chief. It is harder and less glamorous to linger on the fact that in between those scenes someone lay awake for hours scratching mosquito bites, someone else quietly worried about a persistent cough, and another man pulled the same stiff sock over the same unhealed blister for the 15th day in a row. Slow suffering doesn't fit neatly into an adventure frame. It doesn't produce quotable lines. It produces silences, short journal entries, and understated remarks like "the men much fatigued" or "the day very disagreeable." When you line those entries up, though, a pattern emerges. Weather and its bodily consequences didn't just colour the expedition, they shaped its choices. Route decisions often hinged on seasonal expectations. Whether a creek would be fordable or flooded, whether snow would close a pass, whether a frozen surface could briefly become a road. Camp locations were chosen with an eye to shelter from wind, access to wood for fires, and some measure of relief from insects. High banks to catch a breeze, smoky fires set up wind, islands where moving air might keep the worst swarms at bay. The tone of the journals shifts with these conditions. On fair days with manageable temperatures, the entries expand. Detailed notes on botany, geology, ethnography. On days of heavy rain, intense heat, or biting cold, they often contract to the bare bones. Mileage, a few remarks on hardship, then nothing. Mental bandwidth was a finite resource, and the weather rented most of it. When we reconstruct 1804 in our imaginations, we tend to see landscapes and events. The men of the Corps knew another layer that sat right against the skin. Sun that burned, rain that soaked, frost that stiffened fingers, air that vibrated with insect wings. Their journey was not merely across miles, but through a continuous shifting climate that pressed itself into their muscles, their nerves, their sleep, and their moods. Every decision to rest, to move, to risk a crossing, to wait out a storm was made by bodies tired in specific ways, bodies that were far from invincible, and yet, for the most part, kept going. If weather wrapped itself around their bodies, politics wrapped itself around their journey. From almost the moment they left the last settled farms behind, Lewis and Clark were not just travellers. They were diplomats who hadn't slept well in weeks, hauling themselves out of damp blankets to step into rooms where every gesture meant something, and no one fully agreed on what. We tend to imagine councils as a kind of friendly meeting. The captains give a speech, a chief replies, hands are shaken, peace is declared. On the ground, those gatherings were closer to high-stakes theatre. Everyone present knew that what happened in those circles could shape trade, warfare and survival for years. Everyone also knew they were being watched by their own people, by rivals, and, as far as the captains were concerned, by the future eyes of President Jefferson reading their journals. When the expedition approached a village, word usually went ahead of them. Hunters, traders, or scouts had already seen this strange party fighting upriver with massive boats, flying a flag of a new nation many had only heard about at second or third hand. By the time the corps tied up along a bank below, a community like the Oto, Omaha, or later the Mandan and Hidatsa, people were already deciding how this meeting should look. Leaders chose who would sit in the front, who would speak, who would watch in silence. Warriors and young men might arrange themselves to show strength. Elders and religious specialists took their places to show continuity and legitimacy. Women and children watched from roofs and edges, absorbing every move. That arrangement was itself an argument. This is who we are. This is how we are organized. This is the face we show to outsiders. Lewis and Clark did something very similar. They laid out medals, flags, pieces of cloth, sometimes liquor and tobacco. They prepared their talking points. Lewis especially rehearsed his grand speech in his mind. The United States was now the great father, the land was under his protection, peace was expected between tribes, trade would follow the flag. The council ring became a kind of simultaneous performance, two plays on the same stage, written in different languages, running at the same time. The symbols Jefferson had sent west were meant to be unambiguous. A Jefferson Peace Medal stamped with the president's profile, an American flag, a written certificate signed by the captains. In U.S. thinking, these things connected the recipient directly to the new republic, enrolling a leader into a widening web of allegiance. But metal around a neck, cloth on a pole, and marks on paper do not explain themselves. A medal could be many things. It could signal a new trade relationship, a promise that this person would be favoured when the next trader came upriver with guns, powder and cloth. It could mark a successful gamble, this stranger backed the Americans instead of the Spanish or the British or a rival band. It could be valued simply as a beautiful and rare object, to be worn or hidden or melted down and reworked. It could also attract jealousy or suspicion from rivals, who wondered what private agreements lay behind it. A flag could be read as a military standard, a ritual object, or simply a striking piece of coloured cloth. Some communities already had experience with European flags and their shifting meanings. Others did not. A paper certificate written in English script would mean little unless someone who had dealt with colonials before explained its power or lack thereof. The corps speeches were formal, carefully phrased, and by necessity filtered through layers of translation. Lewis might speak in English. His words would be translated into French by one interpreter, then into an indigenous trade language by another, then perhaps again into a local tongue by a third person. Each step compressed and reshaped meaning. Nuanced political language about sovereignty and citizenship had to be rendered in terms related to kinship, obligation, and alliance. Even basic metaphors shifted in transit. When Lewis described the president as a great father, he was using a European paternal image of authority. In many native frameworks, father and brother implied particular duties, rights, and expectations inside existing kinship systems. To accept a father might mean to expect concrete gifts and ongoing aid, not abstract recognition or distant promises. Every time the captains thought they had clearly explained something, what actually reached their listeners was a blend of what could be translated, what fit into existing mental categories, and what people chose to hear. The return speeches they received were filtered the same way, back through French and trade tongues to the captain's ears. By the time Lewis summarized a council in his journal, the original meaning had passed through multiple human minds, each with its own interests. Inside that fog of language, indigenous leaders were not passive. Their goals were often practical and immediate. Trade mattered. Guns, ammunition, metal tools, cloth, and other goods had already been moving along the Missouri in one form or another. This new American expedition was another potential source. A chief might press for assurances. Will your people return with traders? Will they pay better than the Spanish or the British? Will they come every year, or only once? Security mattered. Some nations faced pressure from powerful neighbours. Others were themselves expanding, taking advantage of new horses or guns to assert control over hunting territories and trade routes. When the Corps arrived, they arrived inside those existing contests. A leader might see in the Americans a chance to balance against an enemy, or to intimidate rivals by demonstrating connections to a distant but well-armed power. Information mattered just as deeply. Villages wanted to know, who are you really? How many soldiers do you have behind you? What other foreigners are moving in these lands? What do you know about the price of furs, the intentions of the Spanish on the Rio Grande, or the British in the north? The same questions Lewis and Clark were quietly asking about tribal numbers, alliances, and enemies were being asked about the United States. The councils were also moments when people took the measure of each other as individuals. How did these captains carry themselves? Were they generous with gifts or stingy? Did they show courage, patience, humour, arrogance? Those impressions could weigh as much as any formal declaration. Across the length of the expedition, these dynamics changed with the landscape. Among some smaller or more pressured communities, the Americans could appear as valuable new partners, or as useful tools in ongoing rivalries. Elsewhere, especially in well-established trading centres on the Middle Missouri, the Corps were just one more set of strangers in a long history of outsiders passing through. Villages there had seen Spanish flags, British traders, French trappers. They knew how to play one power against another. An American flag raised over such a place did not erase those memories or that experience. Farther west, among groups whose territories lay closer to crucial river crossings and mountain approaches, the Corps had much less leverage. In those regions, power lay heavily with indigenous nations who controlled horses, knowledge of routes, and the local balance of force. There, diplomacy for Lewis and Clark meant more listening, more gifts, and less confident talk of protecting anyone. There was never a single native response to Lewis and Clark. There were many responses shaped by geography, recent wars, personal histories, rivalries, spiritual understandings, and sheer pragmatism. Some people welcomed the Corps warmly. Some remained cautious but curious. Some saw them as an annoyance or a potential danger to be managed or redirected. A few, later in the journey, met them with open threat. The expedition's journals give us one side of these encounters with unusual detail. We hear the captain's assessments of who seemed friendly, who was inclined to thieve, who accepted the medal with apparent satisfaction. We see where they believed they had secured peace between rival bands or successfully attached a chief to the United States. What we almost never see clearly are the full internal debates on the other side of the circle. We don't hear the conversations that took place after the Corps left the village. The arguments about what the medals really meant, whether the gifts were impressive or disappointing, whether the captains had been honest, whether to warn neighbouring groups or let them find out for themselves. We glimpse traces only when later travellers report a reputation already made, a nation that now speaks of the long knives in a particular way, for good or ill. So when you picture those councils, it helps to hold two things at once. On the surface you have flags, handshakes, tobacco, speeches translated and translated again. Underneath you have calculations and doubts, hopes for trade, fears of disease and dispossession. curiosity about distant cities, and quiet plans about how to use this new relationship or how to endure it. And threaded through all of it is uncertainty. Lewis and Clark wrote what they believed they had accomplished. They described chiefs as well pleased, alliances as established, misunderstandings as explained, but their journals are windows into perception, not guarantees of outcome. Many times, both sides left a council thinking they understood what had been agreed to, while actually carrying away very different stories. The core pushed back out into the current, medals distributed, flags left behind in villages, promises hanging in the air. The river carried them west. The meanings of those councils stayed behind, unfolding slowly in conversations by winter fires, in choices about where to hunt, who to marry, and which distant power, if any, might be worth trusting when the next strange boat appeared on the horizon. Before they ever shook a single hand on the Missouri, the expedition was already navigating a different kind of uncertainty, the shape of the continent itself. Jefferson and the men around him believed, or at least hoped, that the West contained a kind of elegant symmetry. A great river flowed out of the heart of North America toward the Atlantic, the Missouri. Logic, or wishful thinking, suggested there must be a counterpart on the western side. Something like a mirror image, an upper Missouri that would rise near the crest of the continent, followed by a short, easy portage over some modest hills, and then a western river, maybe the fabled River of the West, running gently down to the Pacific. Maps of the time reflected this hope as much as they reflected reality. Lines of rivers bent gracefully toward one another, sometimes connecting in places no one had actually seen. Mountain ranges appeared as neat, narrow bands, placed more by analogy with Europe than by direct observation. On some maps, a single peak or height of land separated the Atlantic and Pacific watersheds, as if the Rockies were a kind of elongated hill rather than a sprawling, folded system of ranges and plateaus. Most of what Jefferson had to work with came from traders' routes, indigenous reports repeated through multiple intermediaries, and a scattering of earlier expeditions, many of which had their own political motives. Spanish and British maps might leave blank spaces or misleading features on purpose, to protect trade secrets or discourage rivals. French cartographers sometimes smoothed uncertainties into confident curves. A dotted line could be the trail of one hunter's memory, but once inked on a fine sheet and labelled carefully, it looked authoritative. Into this world of paper and speculation stepped Lewis and Clark, instructed not just to travel, but to make the map better. Out on the water, making a map did not mean unfurling a neat diagram and tracing a route. It meant building geography from scratch, one careful, often exhausted observation at a time. Lewis carried instruments, sextant, chronometer, compasses, but instruments require clear skies, steady hands, and time. Cloud cover could make celestial observations impossible for days. The river's current tugged at the boats even when they tried to hold position. Mosquitoes, wind, and cold fingers were constant companions. So they did what field observers have always done. They combined moments of precision with long stretches of approximation. When the weather allowed, Lewis took solar and lunar measurements to determine latitude and longitude for key points, river junctions, major bends, significant landmarks. These became anchor points on the mental and eventual physical map. Between those fixed points, they estimated, men with measuring lines walked along the bank to pace off distances. Boatmen judged how far they had come by the pull of the current and the number of hours travelled. Landmarks were noted in relative terms: a sandbar in the middle of the river, a bluff shaped like a tower, a grove of cottonwoods on the right bank. They counted bends. They noted the width of the river, the colour of the water, the direction of tributaries. They tried to keep track of how often they had to pole or cordel their way upstream, because effort itself was a clue to gradient. When they could, they climbed bluffs to look ahead, scanning for new channels or branches. All of this went into their journals at night, written by candlelight, when their hands were still stiff from rowing and hauling. In that kind of work, error is not a flaw. It's a constant companion. Winds pushed the boat sideways. The river might appear to bend north, but the compass could tell a slightly different story. A tributary judged to be of considerable magnitude on one tired afternoon might look less impressive the next day from a higher vantage point. Even the chronometer, their prized timepiece, needed careful management. Let it run down or become slightly inaccurate, and every longitude calculation that depended on it drifted. Despite this, Lewis and Clark became, over the course of the journey, remarkably skilled practical geographers. They weren't just copying old guesses, they were testing them against the stubborn facts of water and earth. And the West kept surprising them. Again and again they reached places where earlier maps had promised clarity, and found only new puzzles instead. One of the earliest and most important of these came when the Missouri began to fork. Which branch was the true continuation of the river Jefferson cared most about? The longest, the clearest, the one local people used as the main route? Traders' tales and rough maps hadn't prepared them for how complicated those choices would be. At the junction that would later be called the Marias River, the Corps stopped and argued with itself through data. Clark, looking at the width and muddy volume of one branch, believed it must be the main stream. Lewis, paying close attention to the clarity and direction of the other, suspected the opposite. They measured current speed, they tasted the water, they questioned the shape of the banks, they sent parties up both forks for days, gathering what we might call field samples of geography. Underlying all of this was the ghost of the imagined map back in Jefferson's study. Somewhere ahead, they believed, the Missouri would bring them as close as possible to the Continental Divide. If they chose the wrong branch now, they feared they might be carried too far north or south and lose any chance at the quickest route. They were not, however, alone with their instruments. Long before the Corps scratched latitudes into their notebooks, indigenous travellers had been moving through this landscape, naming rivers, tracing seasonal paths, creating mental maps that were no less detailed for being unwritten. Those maps didn't look like European charts. They were often organised around travel times, kin relations, hunting grounds and story places rather than abstract grids of latitude and longitude. Again and again, the expedition depended on those alternate ways of knowing. Up and down the Missouri from the lower villages to the high plains and then into the mountains, they asked people which river to follow, where a pass could be found, how long it might take to cross from one drainage to another. A hand drawn in the dirt, a gesture toward a line of distant peaks, a list of camp spots recited by someone who had walked them as a child. These were forms of mapping as real as any made with ink. Later, with the Shoshone and other groups west of the Divide, this dependence deepened. The very idea that there might be a relatively low, practical crossing of the Great Divide at Lemhi Pass came not from European speculation, but from the lived experience of people who had moved horses and goods and families through those mountains. When expectations of a single mild ridge gave way to the reality of range after range, it was indigenous guides who reoriented the Corps, telling them where watercourses connected, where they did not, where the land simply closed in. In the journals, those moments sometimes appear as brief notes. We're informed that, or our guides say, but behind that phrasing lies a fundamental shift. The expedition's official purpose was to bring knowledge of the West home to the United States. In practice, much of what they discovered was knowledge borrowed, rephrased, and then fixed on paper in a style that would be legible to Jefferson and the mapmakers of Philadelphia. Some of the most dramatic course corrections in the journey came when these different mapping traditions collided. A fork that looked minor on a European chart might in fact be the vital path toward a known pass. A small stream in indigenous description might be small only in terms of depth, not in terms of its importance as a route. A short portage might be short in summer, with light loads and long days, but grueling in another season. When Lewis or Clark misunderstood those nuances, they sometimes took longer, harder roads until another meeting, another explanation, nudged them back toward the lines of travel that local people had been using for generations. Looking backward, it's easy to let the finished maps erase the uncertainty that produced them. Open an atlas today and you see the Missouri as a firm blue line, its tributaries branching like nerves, the Rockies shaded with confidence. There is no sign of the days spent doubting at a river junction, of the times when the captains wrote in their journals that they were much at a loss, of the evenings when 2 or 3 different stories about the land ahead all seemed plausible. Later retellings often compress those doubts into a neat narrative of success. The Corps is said to have found the pass, chosen the correct fork, discovered the river connection, as if each decision were clear at the time. Map lines drawn after the fact can make a tangled process look like a single decisive stroke. But for Lewis, Clark, and the people travelling with them, geography was not a finished picture. It was something they were constantly negotiating with, adjusting to, and sometimes resisting. What they wrote down each night was shaped not only by what lay before their eyes, but by what they expected to see. If you believe that a short portage and a smooth western river must exist, you will read the land with that hope in mind. A break in the hills might look like the first promise of the divide. A widening valley might appear to confirm a theory. When reality pushes back, when the single ridge becomes a maze of mountains, when the rivers run the wrong way, you don't simply erase the expectation. You revise it slowly, fitfully, sometimes reluctantly, while still using it as a framework for understanding. In that sense, the expedition's maps are as much documents of changing expectations as they are of fixed geography. With each new observation, each corrected longitude, each bit of guidance received from people who already knew these routes, the imagined West inside Jefferson's mind shifted. The elegant symmetry gave way to a more complicated truth. A continent where watersheds braided and split, where mountains were not a simple wall, but a series of obstacles, where the shortest path from one ocean to the other was not necessarily the one a river could offer. What Lewis and Clark saw of that geography was always filtered, through instruments, through exhaustion, through the advice of those they met, and through the powerful pull of the map they hoped to confirm. The wonder of their journals is that you can watch that filter being adjusted in real time as guesses harden into knowledge and then are softened again by the next bend in the river, the next unexpected ridge, the next quiet correction from someone who had walked that ground long before the first American flag ever appeared on the horizon. When most people picture Lewis and Clark finding their way over the divide, they picture one figure in particular stepping into the story, almost like a character entering from the wings on cue, Sacagawea. In schoolbooks and popular paintings, she appears almost fully formed, the young native woman, pointing the way west, baby on her back, calmly leading a line of uncertain white men through a landscape they barely understand. She becomes the guide, the interpreter, the emblem of peaceful cooperation. Sometimes almost the embodiment of the West itself, rendered in one person. The actual documents from the expedition give us something both smaller and in many ways more interesting. Start with what we can say with some confidence. Sacagawea, her name appears in the journals in several spellings, was a young Shoshone woman who by the time the Corps met her was living among the Hidatsa near the Mandan villages. She had been taken there as a child, likely in a raid. Later, she became one of the wives of Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trader. When Lewis and Clark built Fort Mandan for the winter, they hired Charbonneau as an interpreter. Sacagawea, pregnant at the time, came with him. The captains did not, at first, write about her as a heroic figure. She appears in the journals as the wife of Charbonneau, as part of the household. Her baby, Jean-Baptiste, nicknamed Pomp, is mentioned more often at first than she is. That's one of our clues. For the men keeping the official record, she was not yet a symbol. She was a person in camp, cooking, working, carrying an infant, and yet quietly her presence began to change how the expedition moved through other people's worlds. As spring came and the boats pushed away from Fort Mandan onto the upper Missouri, the Corps was, from a distance, an alarming sight. Armed men, unfamiliar flags, large boats, dogs, supplies, a moving package of potential trouble. Out on those plains, parties of that size usually meant warriors on the way to raid or to press a demand. Women and children sent a different message. When people looking down from a bluff or out from a village saw a young woman and a baby with the strangers, it signaled something important. This was not a war party. These were travelers, trading partners, negotiations in motion, not an invasion force. We know this not because Lewis or Clark write, we cleverly brought a woman to seem peaceful, but because of how often they remark on others' reactions. Villagers are surprised by the boats. Then, as conversation begins, the presence of Charbonneau's family is simply taken in as part of the total picture. Threat is recalibrated. Sacagawea's gender and her role as a young mother softened the silhouette of the Corps at exactly the point in the journey when misunderstandings could most easily have escalated into violence. Her second major role was more direct. Once the expedition left Mandan country and pushed toward the headwaters of the Missouri, they were entering lands where Shoshone horses would be the difference between success and failure. The plan Jefferson imagined on paper depended quietly on animals he never saw. They needed to buy or borrow enough horses to haul supplies across the mountains to whatever river of the West lay beyond. Charbonneau spoke Hidatsa and some French. The Shoshone they were hoping to meet did not. The Corps, in turn, spoke English and relied on French as their main bridge language. So, by the time they finally encountered a Shoshone band near the Continental Divide, conversation involved a relay. Shoshone to Sacagawea, Sacagawea to Charbonneau, Charbonneau to French, French to English. It was not smooth, elegant translation. It was a chain of approximations, but it existed only because a woman taken from her people as a girl now found herself, years later, walking back into their orbit with a group of strangers at her side. The journals record one of the most striking coincidences in the whole journey. The Shoshone leader they first dealt with, Cameawait, was, by Sacagawea's recognition, her brother. Lewis describes the scene of recognition, the emotion, the reunion. It reads almost too perfect, as if crafted for a novel. But it's there in the nightly entries, written before anyone knew it would later be retold in children's books and statues. What we can't say is how Sacagawea understood that moment inside her own mind. Did she see the expedition as a way home, as a job, as something she was swept into by circumstance? The documents are nearly silent on her motivations. No one in the Corps, so far as we know, asked her to dictate her story. And if she did speak at length, those words did not make it into the surviving journals. We know that her linguistic skills helped. She could explain who these Americans were, what they wanted, what they might offer. She could vouch for them as individuals, not just as an anonymous group. She could interpret not only words, but gestures and intentions that Charbonneau might have missed. That kind of translation is hard to quantify, but you can see it in the outcomes. The Corps acquired horses. They got information about mountain passes and river systems that came straight from Shoshone knowledge she helped make comprehensible to Lewis and Clark. We also know that she contributed in more everyday, practical ways that rarely make it into grand paintings. On at least one occasion, when a boat nearly capsized, Clark credits her with keeping her composure under stress and helping to save important papers and instruments from the water. She gathered edible plants, roots and herbs along the way, adding to the expedition's food supply, and sometimes to their medical options. She endured the same cold, rain, hunger and fatigue as the rest of the party all while carrying and caring for an infant. These are not the acts of a mystical guide with perfect foresight. They are the acts of a young woman working, adapting, surviving. Around those solid pieces of evidence, later generations built a much larger figure. In the decades and centuries after the expedition, Sacagawea was gradually transformed from Charbonneau's wife at Fort Mandan into a national icon. Women's suffrage activists adopted her as a model of female courage and competence in a male-dominated story. Western states raised statues showing her in heroic poses, often holding her child and pointing toward a hazy future. School curricula distilled her into a single line: Sacagawea, the Indian Guide. Each of those uses tells us as much about the era doing the remembering as it does about her. For suffragists, she represented the untold contributions of women. For Western boosters, she symbolized indigenous cooperation with American expansion. For modern audiences, she sometimes stands in for all native knowledge on the expedition, as if one person alone carried the maps of half a continent in her mind. In that process, many of the uncertainties are sanded away. We rarely hear that historians still debate details as basic as the correct spelling and pronunciation of her name. We don't linger over the fact that the journals never explicitly call her the guide of the expedition in the sweeping way later stories do. We usually skip past the quiet lines in the record that show Charbonneau complaining, the captains frustrated with him, Sacagawea ill or recovering, the normal frictions and vulnerabilities of real people on a hard journey. Turning her into a symbol of motherhood, of Native America, of guidance, of peace, can make it harder to see her as a person who might have had mixed feelings, private doubts, or motives that don't fit neatly into our preferred narratives. But that tendency is not unique to her. Throughout this story, from Jefferson's imagined maps to the finished atlases, we've seen how people project hopes and fears onto limited information. A dotted river on a chart becomes a promised passageway. A single line in a journal becomes discovery. A woman mentioned briefly as someone's wife becomes, over time, the face of an entire expedition. Sacagawea's story sits at the intersection of those habits. The records of 1804 to 1806 give us glimpses: an interpreter helping broker a critical horse trade, a young mother calming a baby in a bitter wind, a person recognized and embraced by a brother she hadn't seen since childhood, a practical worker saving equipment from the river and roots from the earth. Later storytelling layers meanings over those glimpses until the human being nearly disappears under the symbol. Remembering that difference between what the journals firmly show and what later centuries added is not a way of diminishing her. It is a way of respecting her. She was not a legend walking. She was a person moving through a dangerous, exhausting, confusing world, making choices with the tools and the knowledge she had. The fact that we can see her only through narrow windows doesn't mean we should fill the rest of the room with our own reflections and call it complete. In her, more clearly than almost anyone else on the expedition, you can watch history and myth braid together. And if we look closely at that braid, we begin to see how much of what Lewis and Clark saw in 1804, and how much of what we think we see now, is shaped less by the light of the past and more by the lenses we hold over it. By the time the Corps left the Mandan villages and began working their way up the Missouri in earnest, they were entering a world that in most schoolbook versions barely exists. In a lot of modern maps of the story, the Great Plains look like a wide, blank belt between the civilized east and the dramatic mountains of the west, a stretch to be crossed, the thing you endure on the way to the real story. That is not what they stepped into. For Lewis and Clark, the plains were a living, moving system. A sea of grass, yes, but a sea thick with animals, people, smoke, and rumour. If you could ask any member of the expedition what they remembered from that middle stretch, the answers would probably not be emptiness. They would be motion. Start with the bison. The numbers are hard to pin down. Historians argue over early estimates. but by all accounts, the herds they saw were on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine now. The journals describe the ground shaking, the riverbanks collapsing where animals came down to drink, entire horizons dark with moving backs and horns. On some days they write as if the world itself is made of three things: sky, grass, and buffalo. But even that picture can mislead us if we think of the bison as wild, random abundance with no human pattern laid over it. For generations before the Corps arrived, Plains nations had been shaping where those herds went and how they behaved. Fire was one of their main tools. On a modern interstate across the plains, you might drive for hours without seeing a single active flame. In 1804 and 1805, Lewis and Clark sailed through a landscape where smoke on the horizon was normal, not exceptional. The journals note burned ground, new green shoots, smoke columns that rise and spread until the sun itself looks hazy and distant. Some of those fires were lightning strikes. Many were not. Tribes set burns to clear old grass, to encourage fresh growth that would attract game, to create fire breaks that protected favoured camps, to drive animals, to signal, sometimes to deny an enemy good pasture. Fire was a management tool, a way of tuning the grassland. From the river, the Corps often saw only the results: a blackened expanse here, a brilliant green flush there, a line of flame crawling along a ridge with no obvious cause. They wrote about the difficulty of navigation when smoke reduced visibility, about ash falling on their camp, about the eerie light of sunsets filtered through haze. What they did not always fully grasp was how much of this fire was part of an intentional human pattern, not just a natural disaster breaking into an otherwise untouched wilderness. Over all of this moved the horse. The Great Plains Lewis and Clark entered were already horse country. Horses had been spreading out from the southwest for generations, moving from people to people faster than detailed written records could follow. By the early 1800s, many plains nations had become what historians call horse cultures, societies in which the animal reshaped everything: hunting, warfare, trade, even concepts of distance and possibility. The Corps occasionally notes mounted warriors appearing and disappearing on the skyline with a speed that must have seemed almost uncanny. For men who had just spent months labouring upstream at 2 or 3 miles an hour, to watch riders cover 10 or 15 miles, in what felt like no time at all, was to see geography itself redefined. Those horses stitched together a web of trails and trade routes that crossed and recrossed the very blank space later maps would show as empty. Goods moved. So did news. So did reputations. By the time the Americans arrived, people far out on the plains had already heard of them in distorted second-hand ways. They were not stepping into a silent void. They were stepping into a network that had its own logic, its own roots, its own expectations about visitors and threats. When they met groups of Teton Sioux, Arikara, later Cheyenne or others farther west, they were entering conversations and rivalries already in progress. The land itself complicated all of this. On the plains distance lies. If you grow up among trees or hills, your eye learns to measure space by how quickly objects shrink or disappear behind obstacles. Out in tall grass under a huge sky, there are fewer landmarks. A line of bluffs can look close enough to reach by lunch, and then remain stubbornly far off as the sun moves overhead. A herd on the horizon seems within range until you realize, after hours of walking, that you misjudged both their size and the scale of the land. Lewis and Clark write about this. They complain gently, and sometimes with a kind of weary humour, about deceptive distances. They mention mirages, shimmering pools of water that vanish on approach, distant groves that turn out to be nothing more than clumps of low brush, the way heat and light bend the air until the whole scene seems untrustworthy. For tired men scanning from the deck of a boat, trying to decide whether that dark mass ahead is brush, rock, or a herd of animals, this uncertainty was more than a curiosity. It shaped decisions, where to land, whether to hunt, whether a smoke plume meant a camp close by or a fire tens of miles away. The rivers joined in this shifting act. The Missouri they travelled was not the narrowed and controlled channel you see today, held in place by dams and levees. It wandered. It cut new paths, undercut banks, carried huge rafts of tangled trees. Side channels appeared and disappeared, sandbars formed overnight. The Corps' own maps, careful as they were, sometimes had a short shelf life. Come back a few years later, and the main current might be somewhere else. Along those banks grew galleries of cottonwood and willow, thin ribbons of trees in an otherwise open world. These wooded strips were travel corridors for people, animals, and information. Camps tucked into them, hidden from the open prairie but close to water. Trails connected one shaded bend to the next. If you could fly over the scene, you would see movement flowing along these green veins, not just across the grass. Ecologically, many things were different from today. Species that are now rare or gone in that region were still common. Wolves trailed the bison herds. Grizzly bears occasionally came down onto the plains from the foothills. Elk, antelope, beaver, otter all appear in the journals. The mix varied from place to place, but the general impression is one of abundance, layered over by constant hunting and management, by human communities who relied on that abundance but also shaped it. That's the part our mental picture often leaves out. We imagine before settlement as a time when animals moved purely according to instinct and water flowed by its own whim. In reality, by 1804, fire regimes, hunting practices, herd movements, and even some plant distributions were already being nudged and directed by human decisions, not with fences and ploughs, but with knowledge passed down over generations, when to burn, where to camp, which areas to leave alone for a season because they would be needed next year. For the Corps, this translated into a string of experiences that oscillated between awe and unease. One day the men are nearly giddy at the sight of so much game. We could have killed as many as we pleased, a kind of casual note of superabundance. They feast, they fill their packs, they talk about the fertility of the soil and the possibilities for future farms and towns. Another day they are edgy, watching smoke in all directions, hearing distant drumming, wondering which group is out there and what mood they might be in. They write about nights when the prairie glows at several points on the compass, flame flickering under the stars. They listen to wolves howling and bison lowing and, beneath that, possibly the faint sounds of other camps they cannot see. Sometimes they simply marvel. Clark climbs a bluff and writes of looking out over an immense plain, where the eye can find no boundary. Lewis notes the beauty of wildflowers running in bands and patches across the grass, changing the colour of whole slopes with the season. They are tired, sore, often sick, but they also stop repeatedly, just to try and get the strangeness and scale of it down in ink. This middle world was not the absence of history, it was its own centre. For the nations who lived there, the plains were home, hunting ground, battlefield, marketplace, memory space. Sacred sites dotted the apparently featureless grasslands, particular hills, springs, bends in the river that held stories stretching back before European contact. Trails that the Corps occasionally stumbled onto were not new paths, but old ones, worn deep by hooves and feet and the weight of trade goods long before an American flag ever passed by. When we treat the plains as a blank stretch between important places between St. Louis and the Mandan villages, between Mandan and the Rockies, we repeat, in a quieter way, one of the expedition's own blind spots. They saw much. They recorded more than most travellers of their time would have. But they also often interpreted what they saw through a lens that treated farms and towns as the default markers of value. Land without fences looked unclaimed. Grass without houses looked unused. Meanwhile, under their very boats, networks of obligation, rivalry, and exchange were thick as roots. In the next stages of their journey, as the land began to rise and break, as the grassy sea gave way to broken country, and finally the first fingers of the Rockies, the Corps would discover how costly it could be to mistake a living landscape for a mere interval. But on that long, smoky, shimmering reach of river across the plains, they were already learning that lesson, day after day, camp after camp, often without quite realizing it. When ice began to pinch the river, and the last of the leaves rattled loose from the cottonwoods, the expedition did something that can feel almost like a pause button when you read the story in a textbook. They stopped, they built, they stayed. Wintering at Fort Mandan can sound, in summary, like a logistical footnote, a place to wait out the cold, repair boats, write up notes, and then move on in the spring. But if you look closely, that winter is less an intermission and more the hinge of the entire journey. If things had gone badly there, logistically, medically, politically, there may not have been a famous Lewis and Clark expedition for us to talk about at all. The reasons they stopped were practical and brutal. The Missouri above the Mandan and Hidatsa villages was, in winter, not a friendly road. Ice floes could crush a boat. Blizzards could erase the horizon in minutes. Game shifted its patterns. The river, always dangerous, became an unpredictable machine of moving ice and hidden current. The Corps had already pushed hard that first season. They were entering territory where their maps thinned into guesswork. Their supplies, already stretched, needed to be consolidated, repaired, supplemented. So when they reached the cluster of Mandan and Hidatsa towns in what is now North Dakota, earth lodge villages set above the frozen river, they made a different kind of decision. Instead of trying to muscle on into the unknown in midwinter, they chose to tuck in near people who knew the place. They cut trees. They hauled logs through snow. They put up a stockade and a cluster of rough cabins on the riverbank and named it Fort Mandan. Inside those walls, day-to-day life shrank down to routines that were, in some ways, as narrow and repetitive as any small-town winter. There was building to finish, roofs to tighten against wind that could drive temperatures so low that ink in the inkwell froze. There were constant repairs. Weapons, tools, clothing, all had been worn hard for months. Leather needed mending. Gunflints needed replacing. Oars cracked in the cold and had to be remade. The keelboat, which had been their moving home and warehouse, needed attention before it could even think of heading back downstream with specimens and reports. Food, which had sometimes felt limitless on the summer and fall river, turned into arithmetic. They hunted when they could, bison, deer, elk out on the frozen plains, but storms and deep cold made every hunting trip a gamble. They learned to ration meat and flour, to stretch their remaining trade goods, to eat a monotonous but sustaining diet. Salt, fat, and calories mattered more than variety. A spoiled barrel or a misjudged hunting party could mean hungry days. To fill the hours not taken up by survival, they made work where they could. Journals mentioned sewing, carving, making candles, mending moccasins, testing new equipment. Men who were not usually writers were required to keep records. Lewis spent long stretches describing plants, animals, and geology in almost obsessive detail, the way some people today might disappear into a winter project with spreadsheets or crafting. There was discipline, and beneath it, boredom. Military routine did not go into hibernation. There were inspections, orders, punishments for drunkenness or disobedience. In a confined wooden world, tempers could flare. The officers had to maintain a balance between strictness to prevent chaos, and enough tolerance to get men through months of cold confinement without breaking them. So they also entertained themselves. They sang. They told stories. They put on small celebrations for Christmas and New Year's, using up precious alcohol and sugar in the name of morale. They visited the nearby villages and hosted visitors in return. There are moments in the journals when you can almost hear the sigh in the ink, the sense of time stretching, of the river frozen, of the great unknown West held just out of reach, waiting for the thaw. All of this, though, was taking place inside a wider circle of community that was not of their own making. They had built a fort, but they had not built a world. That world already existed in the Mandan and Hidatsa towns around them. Compact, earth-covered houses huddled in rows, smoke drifting from central holes, storerooms filled with corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, networks of kin and trade that reached out across the plains and up and down the Missouri. The expedition did not simply perch beside these villages as neutral observers. Their survival depended on them. Trade began almost immediately. The Corps needed corn, vegetables, sometimes meat. The Mandan and Hidatsa had surpluses of agricultural products. In return, the Americans offered metal tools, cloth, beads, and crucially the promise of future trade and alliances with the Great Father far downriver. Knowledge moved with those goods. Around hearths and in council houses, through interpreters of varying skill, the Americans asked questions. Where are the headwaters of this river? How far to the mountains? Who lives beyond you? How do they travel? What do they trade? Who are their enemies? What trails lead where? Maps were sketched in the dirt on paper, in memory. The picture of the West that Lewis and Clark had brought from St. Louis, already a patchwork of rumour and conjecture, was being overwritten with the mental maps of people who had actually lived the routes for generations. From the Mandan and Hidatsa, they heard about the Shoshone in the mountains, about the rough country ahead, about other nations who might help or hinder them. They began to understand that the Rockies were not a single simple ridge to cross, but a complex barrier. They learned where horses could be found, where trade fairs took place, how paths threaded through river valleys and overpasses. Some of this information was accurate, some was partial, coloured by politics, fear, or simple limits of perspective. But without it, their spring advance would have been blind in a way even their considerable courage could not have compensated for. At the same time, the Americans themselves were not just passive students. They were also, from the Mandan and Hidatsa point of view, a new and potentially dangerous factor in an already crowded field of relationships. Guns in particular mattered. The Corps offered repair of firearms and sometimes presented weapons as gifts. In a world where horses, guns, and trade access could tilt the balance between nations, these interactions were not small. Mandan and Hidatsa leaders had to calculate how might this new source of goods and prestige affect their position relative to the Lakota to the south, to other neighbours up and down the river. So the winter relationships were layered. There was warmth and curiosity visits, shared ceremonies, exchanges of children's games and songs. There was calculation who gets closest access to these newcomers, who receives the most attention, who is publicly acknowledged in council. There was tension, moments when thefts, misunderstandings, or perceived slights led to angry words or the threat of violence. All of this unfolded under a constant, mostly invisible pressure, disease. By the time Lewis and Clark arrived, the Mandan and Hidatsa had already endured waves of smallpox and other illnesses introduced from distant contact zones to the east and south. Their populations had been reduced, their social fabric strained. The very fact that there was room for the Americans to build a fort nearby was, in part, the result of those earlier demographic shocks. During the winter at Fort Mandan itself, there is no single documented epidemic sweeping directly from the Corps into the villages or back again in a way historians can trace day by day. But everyone there lived with the memory, or at least the cultural memory, of sickness that came from far away and did not behave like any known local disease. Sharing air in close rooms, trading objects, gathering for councils and celebrations, none of these acts can be cleanly separated from that broader history of pathogens moving along the same routes as trade goods and stories. The balance between the benefits of contact and the risks it carried was fragile, and not always visible to the people living through those cold months. Underneath the everyday routines, another kind of work was happening too, the slow forging of relationships under stress. Lewis and Clark needed allies. So did the Mandan and Hidatsa. Everyone understood in one way or another that the ice would eventually break, and with it would come movement, of the expedition westward, of traders, of rival war parties. Conversations in that winter had a double life. On the surface they might be about sharing tobacco, comparing hunting stories, marvelling at a compass or a steel trap. Underneath they were about testing trust. Who keeps their word? Who exaggerates? Who looks eager for guns or promises? Who seems cautious? Some bonds formed that were genuinely cooperative, built on mutual help in harsh conditions. Others were frankly transactional, corn for cloth, information for gifts. Some were tense almost from the start, as when visiting groups from rival nations came into the orbit of Fort Mandan and competed for attention or access. Through it all, the Americans were quietly deciding who seemed reliable enough to count on when they pushed off toward the unknown mountains. The Mandan and Hidatsa, in turn, were deciding how much to invest in these strangers who claimed to speak for a distant, powerful government that none of them had ever seen. From a distance in time, the winter can look quiet. No great battles, no dramatic crossings, just snow, wood smoke, and the scratch of pen on paper. But in that quiet, the shape of the rest of the expedition was being set. They left Fort Mandan in the spring with repaired gear, refreshed supplies, and journals full of observations. More importantly, they left with a mental map that pointed them toward the Rockies, a sense of where horses and guides might be found, and the beginnings of alliances that would later bring Sacagawea and others into their orbit. If the river was the road, this winter stop was the only real town along it, a place where information pooled, where people from different worlds shared shelter from the same cold, and where, in the slow months of snow and waiting, the fate of the journey tilted toward survival rather than disappearance into the white. When they pushed away from Fort Mandan in the spring, they were not just leaving winter behind. They were sailing out of the last place on the Missouri where almost anyone had a clear, lived-in mental picture of what lay ahead. Beyond the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, the river bent toward a part of the continent that, for the Americans, existed mostly as lines on a map and stories passed through several sets of ears. On paper, back in Jefferson's study, the plan still looked clean. Follow the Missouri to its source, carry boats and gear over a short portage across the mountains, drop into a western river, ideally some equivalent of the Missouri, flowing the other way, and ride it down to the Pacific. A single climb, a ridge, a descent, one hard step between two vast systems of watery highway. Out on the actual river, that idea began to die by degrees. The first big shock was the sheer duration of the climb. The Missouri did not suddenly turn into whitewater at the foot of a looming wall of granite. It rose, gradually but relentlessly, into a landscape that kept hinting at a crest just ahead, and then, stubbornly, did not deliver. There were false hopes. A stretch of bluff that silhouetted in the distance looked like it might be the first ranks of the mountains, only to resolve into more rolling prairie as they drew near. A line of hills that felt like the edge of something, only to be followed by another line, and then another. The Rockies, from the eastern side, are not a simple wall. They are a system of uplifted blocks and folded ranges, foothills and benches and plateaus. You do not so much hit them as become entangled in them. The terrain began to take it out of their equipment, as well as their bodies. As the river grew shallower and more broken, the big dugout canoes and pirogues that had served them well lower down became liabilities. They were heavy, awkward, hard to maneuver around shoals and into narrow side channels. Poles snapped against hidden rocks, hulls scraped and split, oars already tired from a year of use, broke under the new strain. Moving upstream against the current had always been work. Now, with more boulder gardens, more sandbars, more twists, it became something closer to punishment. Every mile felt earned in sweat and profanity. Food, which had seemed abundant again when the spring hunts went well around Fort Mandan, began to feel less inevitable as they moved into new country. Game did not vanish, but its patterns were different. Herds were less predictable. The land itself narrowed. River bottoms that had once been wide, rich strips of grass and cottonwood pulled tight between rising bluffs. There was less room for large herds to linger, fewer predictable bottlenecks where hunters could count on finding meat. On some stretches they lived well. On others they wrote about hunger, about the monotony of eating the same stringy meat day after day, about the worry that came when even that supply looked uncertain. Roots, berries, and fish could help, but only if they knew where to find them and had time to stop long enough to collect them. Timing in this landscape was not a background detail. It was the difference between challenge and real danger. Spring runoff could turn a manageable stream into a churning barrier. A storm at the wrong moment could soak powder, ruin meat, and strand them for days. Snow lingering in high passes could delay crossings, compressing their schedule on the far side. They did not always get the timing right. At several points in the journey, they were essentially racing the seasons without fully understanding the course. They had a general idea: move fast enough to cross the mountains before snow closed the highest ground, reach the far side in time to avoid being trapped in some unknown western valley for the winter. But the continent did not care about their deadlines. The further they went, the more they had to admit a hard truth. Without horses, and without local knowledge of trails and passes, they were almost immobile once the river ceased to be their main road. So the search for mountains became, almost immediately, a search for people. The Mandan and Hidatsa had already told them, beyond the next great bend of the river lived the nations who knew the passes and traded in horses. The Shoshone in particular, Snake Indians in some of the terminology of the time, were described as the ones most likely to have what the expedition needed to move overland. Horses changed everything. A loaded canoe can glide on water with relatively little effort once it's moving. The same amount of weight on human backs, on steep, rutted ground at high altitude, turns the simplest portage into an ordeal. Horses could carry gear, hunt faster, and perhaps most importantly carry the sick and exhausted. But horses were not a raw material you could gather from the landscape. They were property, part of complex networks of ownership, war, and trade. Acquiring them meant negotiation, gifts, promises. It meant getting along well enough with people who had every reason to be cautious about arming or strengthening strangers. Guides mattered just as much. Knowing that somewhere ahead there was a pass did not tell you where to find the one that would actually work for a caravan of tired men and skittish animals. A trail could be anything from a braided network of well-worn paths to a faint line of broken grass used only in certain seasons. Some led to good water and forage, others led to dead ends or into the territories of enemies. When the expedition did manage to secure guides, from individuals like Sacagawea's relatives or other local experts, they were not just hiring direction finders. They were tying themselves for a time into someone else's mental map of the mountains, where snow lingered longest, where a stream could be forded, where a steep slope became too dangerous for loaded animals. The journals suggest that sometimes this worked beautifully. A knowledgeable guide could shave days of trial and error off a crossing. At other times misunderstandings arose. A short way, in one person's experience, might feel like an endless detour to someone carrying a pack. Under all of this, something quieter was happening. The slow collapse of the simple geographical fantasy many of them had carried from the East. They had been raised on maps that showed the continent as a kind of symmetric body. Big river to the east, big river to the west, spine of mountains in between. From a distance, it could look almost neat. Up close, in aching muscles and broken gear and endless ridges, that neatness dissolved. They began to understand that the Rockies were not one obstacle, but many layered obstacles, ranges behind ranges, watersheds nested inside watersheds. Crossing them was not a single effort, but a sequence of efforts, each one demanding more from bodies already worn down by months of travel. Psychologically, that realization may have been as heavy as any load they strapped onto a horse. You can see hints of it in the tone of some journal entries. The optimism when a horizon looks promising. The deflation when that horizon breaks into more high ground. The growing respect, sometimes grudging, sometimes admiring, for the nations who moved through this terrain routinely, who not only survived here but built lives, trade and ritual into its folds. There were moments of genuine discouragement. The idea that the continent might open suddenly, that they would crest a final rise and see a broad western river valley inviting them down toward the Pacific, lingered longer than you might expect. Each time that vision failed to appear, they had to recalibrate their expectations a little further toward reality. They could not always know in the moment which pass was the best possible choice, or whether a desperate decision, eating poorly, pushing on in bad weather, trusting a guide whose language they barely shared, would pay off or nearly break them. Historians can reconstruct some of their routes, compare their notes to modern topography, see where they made fortunate choices, where they simply endured. But from inside the expedition, what they mostly felt was uncertainty stacked on fatigue. The Rockies, for them, were not a dramatic single scene between Act 2 and Act 3 of the story. They were a drawn-out encounter with a physical system larger than any one map could capture, mediated at every turn by diplomacy, by the willingness of strangers to lend or sell horses, to walk ahead and show the way, to share enough food and knowledge to keep the Americans moving instead of stuck in some blind canyon. What they discovered in those months was not just a route over a mountain range, but a more complicated truth, that the continent was bigger, more broken, and more dependent on human relationships than the lines Jefferson had traced on paper ever admitted. Somewhere in the middle of that realization that the mountains were not a line but a system, and progress was not a march but a negotiation, this is a good place to pause, just briefly, and tell you what we've tried to do with all of this in book form. If you're listening to this and thinking, I wish I could walk through these details at my own pace, reread a passage, see how the pieces fit together, that's exactly why we made a book to go with this channel. It's at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount running for listeners of the show. But the book isn't just a written version of the episodes. It tries to do on the page what we've been doing in your headphones. Take the parts of the story that usually get one sentence in a textbook, the hunger between forts, the broken oars, the tense silences in a council house, and give them enough room to be lived in. It lingers on the dull-sounding things that actually decided what happened next. Where grass grew thick enough for horses, how far sound carried over frozen river ice, what it meant to wake up in the middle of the night and realize your only compass had been left miles downstream. It brings in the small pieces of evidence that often stay in scholarly articles and archival boxes, a side remark in a French trader's journal that explains a strange gap in the Corps' own notes, a Mandan oral tradition that shades in a moment Lewis skates past, the way a later Blackfeet narrator remembered the first sight of Americans moving through ground that had always belonged to someone else. The point isn't to overwhelm the story with footnotes. The point is to show how, when you really sit with those fragments, the familiar outlines of Lewis and Clark start to twist, stretch, and sometimes flip inside out. For instance, the neat idea of discovery begins to look less like a brave first step into blank space, and more like one late arrival in a landscape that was already mapped in minds, songs, and trade relationships. The hero story of two men starts to blur into a longer list of names. Women who interpreted, hunters who went ahead alone, children whose presence changed the tone of a campfire conversation. We try to be careful about what we can say and what we can only suspect. Where the evidence is solid, An entry in a journal, a known campsite, a dated map, we lay it out. Where historians argue, we invite you into that argument gently, offering possibilities rather than pronouncements. Where a story has hardened into myth, we show you the hairline cracks that suggest another version might be close by. And always under everything is the same question that shapes this episode. What did they really see, hear, and feel compared to what later generations have wanted them to have seen? If that kind of slow, careful, sleep-friendly history appeals to you, you can find the book at sleepytimehistory.com with that listener discount in place this week. You don't have to go there now, you can just let the thought sit somewhere in the back of your mind, like a landmark you might visit later. Because for Lewis and Clark there was no option to step out of the story and look at it from above. Once they left Fort Mandan and slipped deeper into the half-known, they were committed. Each bend in the river wrote the next line for them. So let's drift back to where we left them. Somewhere in that rising country where the Missouri is still technically a river, but already beginning to behave like something else. The water itself is about to change character. For most of the journey so far, the Missouri has been the dominant force in the story. Wide, pushing, muddy, the kind of river that can move whole trees and threaten to take the unwary with them. It has been both enemy and ally. As they climb, that balance starts to shift. The river splits, braids, becomes more temperamental and less reliable as a road. Tributaries come in from the west and south, cold and swift from snowmelt. Each one a possible hint of the way up, and each one a possible dead end that runs into a cliff or a box canyon. In the book, we follow these choices slowly, almost day by day, because this is where a single wrong turn or a single lucky conversation could mean weeks gained or lost. On the ground, they did not see a blue line labelled Missouri and a clear fork labelled Jefferson or Marias. They saw multiple channels, willow thickets, and the colour of the water. Here, too, new nations begin to enter the story. Beyond the Mandan and Hidatsa, beyond the Arikara and the nations of the prairie, they are moving toward the homelands of peoples whose names often show up only as footnotes in classroom versions. Different bands of Shoshone, Salish-speaking communities, Blackfeet and others whose territories overlap and pinch together around key rivers and passes. Each of these nations has its own history with horses, with enemies, with the trade routes that skirt and cross the Rockies. Each one will have its own reasons to welcome, ignore, test, or threaten the newcomers. The danger here is not always a drawn bow or a raised rifle. Sometimes it is simply being turned away, pointed toward a harder pass, left to face the mountains with too few animals and not enough food. Sometimes it is a misread gesture in a sign language conversation on an open plain, a gift that feels too small, a gunshot at the wrong moment that echoes into old grievances the Americans barely understand. When people imagine the western side of the journey, they often picture one simple narrative. The men reach the top of the mountains, look down, and see a gentle river dropping toward a blue, welcoming Pacific. The hard part is over. From there it's just a downhill glide. Almost none of that is accurate. The western slope does not begin as a soft descent. The rivers that drain it, the Lemhi, the Salmon, the Clearwater, the Snake, the Columbia, are not friendly versions of the Missouri repeated on the other side. They are narrower, steeper, and in crucial places, much more dangerous. They do not always flow in the direction that seems most convenient to a mind still organized around an eastern map. The people along those rivers are not waiting passively to be met. They are already trading, defending, and deciding how much of their hard-earned local knowledge to share with these strangers who have somehow appeared from the rising sun, carrying promises, suspicions, and measles. Our book spends a lot of time on that western slope, because it is one of the most not-what-you-think parts of the story. The canoes that felt secure on the Missouri become death traps in canyon rapids. The horses that were so desperately sought on the eastern side become liabilities in cliffy, forested country where a misstep can send an animal and its load tumbling into rock and water. The great hope of an easy water route to the Pacific dissolves into a patchwork of terrifying portages and difficult compromises. We are not there yet in our tale. For now, imagine the expedition still inching upstream, watching the water get colder and clearer, feeling the current quicken under the hull. They do not know that on the far side of the mountains, the rivers will be sharper and more violent. They do not yet realize that the northwest passage of their dreams is, in any practical sense, a mirage. All they can see is what is immediately ahead, a river that feels more like a stairway than a road, a horizon that refuses to flatten and hints, through rumors, tracks, and distant smoke of new nations and new negotiations, waiting just upstream. Beyond the next bend, the waterways will cease to be familiar companions and become tests in their own right. Beyond the next divide, the dangers will be less about getting stuck and more about being swept away. On the maps they carried in their heads, rivers were still roads. Even as the Missouri turned trickier and more divided, the basic assumption held: if water flows, you can probably follow it. If you can follow it, you can probably carry trade and messages and soldiers along it. That was the underlying promise of the whole expedition. When they finally crossed over and began to descend the western side of the continent, that quiet assumption started to shatter. The shift is subtle at first. You move from the long, open perspectives of the plains and the high headwaters, where distance is something you can see, into a world where distance is something you hear. Water sounds different on the western slope. Instead of a broad, muddy push, you get pulses and drops, collisions with rock. Instead of a single channel that meanders, you get water that has decided to cut, to choose a line and stick to it with violent conviction. To men raised along the relatively gentle eastern rivers, and hardened by the Missouri's wide, messy force, this could feel like stepping into a different category of river entirely. The Corps' journals, when they reach places like the Lemhi and the Salmon, and then the Clearwater and Snake, start to fill with words that are working hard just to keep up. They write of very rapid, foaming, boiling, rocky, impetuous water. They stack adjectives the way you might stack sandbags against a flood. You can feel them groping for comparison points that no longer quite fit. They know how to talk about falls because they have seen the great falls of the Missouri, that long, brutal stairway of broken river. But here, on the western slope, danger isn't only a few dramatic drops you can walk around. It's mile after mile of water that is almost, but not quite navigable. Water that offers just enough hope to tempt you in, and just enough hidden rock to break a canoe, a leg, or a skull. This is where risk management stops being an abstract virtue and becomes a daily survival skill. On the plains, a bad decision might mean losing time, losing a horse, suffering more deeply from weather or hunger. On the steep rivers of the West, a bad decision can mean watching your powder, your tools, your medicines, and your notes vanish downstream in seconds. So they argue with themselves in ink. One day they write confidently about the best course of action. The next day that plan is abandoned because the river has revealed something new. A rock garden no one saw from camp. A bend that turns out to be a chute. Rapids force choices that are never clean. Portage and you lose days, burn food, grind men and animals down with carrying loads over slick boulders and through alder thickets. Run the water and you gain speed. But you stake everything on your ability to read liquid topography that you've never seen before. The journals will sometimes sound decisive. We resolved to run the rapids. We determined to make a portage. But if you look closely at the surrounding entries, you see the texture of doubt underneath. Long descriptions of great anxiety, of sleepless nights calculating the odds, of arguments around the fire as men who have to paddle the boats question the men who give the orders. Even the act of describing becomes strained. The vocabulary they brought with them was built for bottomland farms and tidal rivers, for the Missouri's shifting mud and sandbars, for the careful English of military reports. When they try to put a Western Canyon River into those words, the language itself starts to creak. They repeat phrases. They contradict themselves. A stretch of water is the worst we have ever seen, and then a page later another is still more dangerous. They compare a rapid to one back east, then immediately admit the comparison is imperfect, because no one in Tidewater, Virginia has seen a current like this. In that awkwardness, you can hear the shock of a different world. The environment is changing under their feet and under their boats, but so are the resources that determine how they can move through it. On the plains and upper Missouri, meat has been the default strategy. Bison when they can get it, elk and deer, smaller game and birds when they cannot. They know how to hunt on open ground. They know how far sound travels. They know how much ammunition they can afford to spend. On the western slope, the hunting patterns they trust run into their limits. The terrain tightens. Forest begins to close in. Visibility shrinks. The big herds are no longer part of the daily background. Animals use the broken country to disappear. You can still kill an elk, but you might break your neck hauling it back to camp. At the same time, new resources appear that are no longer occasional treats, but basic possibilities. Fish move from being a side note in the journals to being, in some stretches, the only thing standing between the core and disaster. Salmon runs, whitefish, trout, the men rely more and more on nets, weirs, hooks, and crucially, on the knowledge of people who have been harvesting these fish for generations. This is another way the rivers have stopped being roads and started being something more complex. They are now pantries and trade routes and territorial boundaries and spiritual presences all at once. They are the backbone of economies that do not match Jefferson's mental model of neat farmland and small towns spreading along gentle water. On their descent, Lewis and Clark move through a braid of cultural landscapes that are every bit as intricate as the watersheds themselves. They encounter Shoshone groups whose entire political calculus around horses and war is shaped by the passes and headwaters behind them. They meet Salish-speaking peoples whose seasonal rounds trace the salmon, who have protocols for who fishes where and when. They arrive at villages of Nez Perce, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Chinookan communities, farther downriver, each with distinct expectations for visitors, distinct histories with upriver and downriver neighbours. The journals sometimes flatten these differences with phrases like the Indians, but in the details you can see how varied and structured these societies are. A gesture that secured help from one group might mean insult to another. A trade item that carried weight on the plains might feel trivial in a village where dentalium shells, woven hats, or certain colours of beads signal status and obligation. A council style that worked on the Missouri, formal speeches, medals, flags, suddenly feels mismatched in longhouses where authority is shared differently, where the important talk happens after the visitors think the meeting is over. The Corps' records on the surface can read as confident through all of this. They keep up the tone of orderly progression. This day we travelled so many miles, saw this many people, recorded these animals, made these decisions. It's the language of control, but threaded through that is an undercurrent of strain. You see it when they describe being fed by hosts because they cannot yet feed themselves. You see it when they confess to feeling much at a loss in conversations where sign language, a few shared words, and Sacagawea's and other interpreters' efforts are stretched to the breaking point. You see it when they note, with unease, that their guns are rusting in the persistent wet, that their best boatmen are shaken by particular rapids. The western slope forces them to admit, even if only in private lines of ink, that their categories are running out. River, but not a river you can simply ascend or descend. Alley, but with interests that do not line up neatly with American purposes. Danger, but not always in forms they have been trained to recognize. Later tellings of the expedition often speed through this part. They leap from crossed the mountains to floated down to the Pacific, as if the western rivers were a gentle conveyor belt. When you slow the story down to the pace of their actual travel, a different picture emerges. You see men standing on a canyon rim, trying to decide if this is water or a trap. You see leaders whose inked words sound sure, even as the spaces between those words are full of doubt. You see an empire's idea of a continent bending reluctantly to fit the carved reality of stone and water that was already known, already named, already lived in by others. On that western slope, the road Jefferson imagined turns into something else. A series of hard bargains with gravity, with local politics, and with the simple fact that the world does not care what your maps expected to find. By now, the expedition we've been travelling with in our minds may feel a little different from the one that usually shows up on classroom walls and coffee mugs. When most people picture Lewis and Clark in 1804, they see a clean line on a map, an arrow moving steadily west. Brave men in buckskins gliding through untouched wilderness, pausing now and then to plant a flag and write a noble sentence in a leather-bound journal. But the world they actually moved through looked and felt very different from that smooth line, and very different from that empty, pristine stage. Travel was not a bold, heroic stride. It was a long, grinding negotiation with water and mud, with wind, with hunger, with sore feet and blistered hands. It was rowing until your back spasmed, poling until your shoulders shook, dragging boats through shallows, hauling cargo over ice, waking up to frozen moccasins and swarms of insects, and doing it again the next day because the river and the orders and the season didn't care how tired you were. The landscapes were not waiting for discovery. They were already spoken for. Villages, fields, burning grasslands, carefully managed bison, fishing weirs, trade routes, boundaries marked by stories and obligations. Lewis and Clark did not walk into a blank canvas. They passed through a set of overlapping human worlds that had their own maps, their own politics, their own history of migrations, alliances, and grief. And everything the Corps wrote, everything we now treat as observation, was filtered through the things they needed and the things they expected to find. When they looked at a river, they saw potential transport or a barrier, depending on whether the current helped or hindered their boats. When they looked at a village, they saw allies or rivals, depending on how those people might fit into an American diplomatic plan that the villagers had never agreed to. When they looked at a prairie, they sometimes saw rich farmland in the making, even when that prairie was the product of thousands of years of deliberate burning and careful movement of animals. They were not neutral cameras, they were human beings on a mission, writing at the end of long days, with sore hands in bad light, trying to translate a continent into words that a president and a distant government might understand. All of our big themes flow back into that gap between what was actually happening and what later readers like to imagine. Uncertainty was constant, not rare. The journals look calm partly because the genre demands it. You write in measured sentences. You number the miles. You list the temperatures. You make decisions sound like single moments of clarity, but inside those simple entries were days and nights of not knowing. Not knowing if the next bend in the Missouri would bring a waterfall or a clear passage. Not knowing if today's friendly council would turn into tomorrow's tense standoff. Not knowing if the animals you depended on would show up when your bullets were running low. Not knowing if winter would break when you needed it to, or hold on just a few weeks longer and turn an ambitious plan into a slow emergency. Diplomacy, too, was more fragile than legend makes it seem. Later stories tend to flatten the expedition into a string of successful meetings, medals given, hands shaken, alliances forged. The reality on the ground was a lot more conditional. Aid could be generous, but it could also be strategic. A tribe might feed the Corps, guide them, even help save their lives, not because of any special love for the United States, but because of their own calculations about enemies' trade routes and future leverage. Misunderstandings were common. Translators worked through chains of languages. Signs were misread. Respect in one culture looked like indifference in another. A promise spoken in careful English might be heard through ears tuned to very different concepts of obligation and time. Ecology, the living world around them, was not simply abundant or scarce. It was patterned. Animals moved along routes shaped by human fire and human hunting. Forests grew in places where people let them grow and disappeared where people did not want them. Even the so-called wilderness zones between big villages were crisscrossed by paths, by knowledge of where to find roots, where to gather berries, where to cut timber, where to avoid spirits or enemies. Against that complexity, the legend we inherit is very simple. It prefers clean contrasts, discovery instead of encounter, wilderness instead of homeland, destiny instead of improvisation. It likes a brave line moving confidently west, not a series of hesitations, backtracks and compromises. Myths form this way because our minds like stories that are easy to carry. We smooth the rough edges, we forget how many people were already there. We choose a few faces to stand for thousands of others. We let later agendas, national pride, land hunger, nostalgia repaint the past in colours that feel flattering or comforting. And we practice a kind of selective memory, even with the journals themselves. We quote the heroic parts, the big vistas, the noble phrases. We skim past the entries about illness, about failed hunts, about awkward councils where nobody quite understood what the others meant. We turn a complex human journey into a kind of origin myth. If you've stayed with this story, listening in the dark, you've already been resisting that simplification. You've slowed the expedition back down to human speed. You've let uncertainty, miscommunication, and exhaustion sit alongside courage and curiosity. You've allowed the land to be not just scenery, but a network of relationships. If this quieter, more detailed way of travelling through history feels good to you, it helps a lot if you take a moment, maybe tomorrow, when you're more awake, to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. If you feel like sharing, you can tell us where you're listening from, what part of the world your own bed and night sounds belong to. Those small actions tell the algorithms that slow history has a place here, that there's room on this platform for stories that are careful and a little more honest. And if you're curious about the deep past that shaped us long before 1804, you might also like the book this series grew out of, about the prehistoric bottlenecks and quiet catastrophes that almost erased our species and the strange paths that led from a few thousand survivors to everyone alive today. For now, you don't have to remember all the details. You can let the names of rivers and nations, the dates and distances sink down into that soft space where thoughts begin to blur at the edges. Just keep hold of one gentle idea. The past was full of people as real and complicated as you, walking through worlds that were already old, already known, already entangled with other lives. Lewis and Clark were not the first eyes or the last. They were two more sets of travellers looking out at a living continent, trying to turn what they saw into words. We live in the long aftermath of those words and of many others, and we have the quiet power to choose which versions we carry forward, whether we repeat the smooth legend or make a little more room for doubt, for other voices, for the people the first story left out. As you lie here, you can let your own thoughts drift the way their boats did, carried by a current. You don't have to steer. If you want, you can follow that current into sleep, knowing that the story will still be here when you wake up, and that there are always more hidden corners of history waiting patiently to be noticed.